But the other side of what? It took Naruto a moment to realize it was sunlight. He hadn't seen the sun in all its glory in what felt like months, and seeing the brilliant gold coat the ground once more was almost painful. When the world returned to focus, it returned as a world Naruto didn't remember. Where were the archaic cliffs, the barren land, the clotting mist? The sky loomed above him as an insurmountable dome, endless and interminable, but Naruto felt as if he could reach up and graze his fingertips against the stratosphere. He felt both invulnerable and insignificant. But his attention was soon captivated by something else. A grand temple rose from the white ground, deiform in form and structure, untouched, as if every plane and shadow had been crafted by something so grand nothing could reach it, not ice, dust, or light. "What is this?" he asked, captivated. "Where are we?" Kurama spared the view a brief glance, brief, but filled with a quiet sadness. He continued forwards, making towards the tremendous mouth of the structure, bracketed in by elaborate pillars of carved figures, glowing like diamond or gold. "Mahabodhi," Kurama replied. "Another one of the Rikudo Sennin shrines?" Naruto returned, curious. "Does this one have one of his sacred tools?" "Of a sort," answered the fox, with a secretive smile. "And no, it does not." He looked down at the sword in his hand, feeling perhaps a bit gleeful. "It contains something of far more importance." "And what is that?" "The Rui Jingubang." "Right," Naruto agreed, slowly. "Again, you say that like it means something to me." The fox appeared to think deeply on this, as he made his way up the silent, looming staircase. The Sage of Six Paths had many sacred items, he began, quietly, but none are more important than his staff and his sword. He held up the sword in Naruto's hand. His sword, the sword of Susanoo, sometimes referred to as the Aim no Habakiri. "And this staff?" Naruto affirmed. "Is just as sacred and just as powerful." He continued. But the idea of retrieving the powerful Shikujo hadn't crossed his mind until Naruto had mentioned it. He was just as confused as Naruto in that regard. Why would the blonde have said that? Why would he connect the Uchiha to a Kakura? It hadn't even occurred to Kurama. Not until Naruto had suggested the staff as a weapon. Now it made perfect sense. The Uchiha were the last remnants of the great sage to still exist on Earth, or rather, they were the most direct lineage. The other half had long since grown convoluted and untraceable. So of course the Uchiha would be fit to wield the legendary staff. He was probably just as suited for the sword, but Kurama had no intentions of relinquishing it any time soon. Not to mention that Naruto was incredibly adept with the sword. So much so that it surprised him. There was no point in attempting to train him in some other weapon. "Huh," Naruto said, thoughtful. The temple was as silent as a tomb. He remembered it to be crowded with disciples, prayer songs diffused in the air, the sharp clang of training swords as young monks practiced in the courtyard. It was nothing but a hollowed, stone sarcophagus now, each of his footsteps echoing ominously in the unbearable silence. It felt very discomforting to see this place after an endless infinity had come and gone, a place that, for so long, he could only reach in his memories. And even then, it had faded into a place he couldn't reach, obscured with time until he could barely remember it, and all the memories he held here. Kurama was surprised by how much it affected him, seeing it again. Far more than he had anticipated, and he found himself more bewildered than annoyed. The demon fox was far too caught up in his own musings to realize they were bleeding into Naruto's. But the blonde kept silent, curious and fascinated by the rolling tide of thoughts flowing through him. He felt lost. He didn't know whether it was coming from him or Kurama, maybe both. There was a cold emptiness in his heart. He felt as if he was coming home, and everything was exactly how he remembered it, but he could no longer connect to it. He held something lovely and wonderful, but no longer remembered what to do with it. And now he wandered in a familiar world, only to find that he could no longer even remember himself. Naruto reminded himself that these weren't his feelings. Hell, he'd never seen this shrine in his life. Regardless, he could not shake himself out of the constricted hold it had on him. The emotions were too strong. This place must be very important to the fox, for it to affect him so greatly. "Did you grow up here?" he found himself asking, on impulse. It seemed to be the only rational explanation. Why else would he feel so much nostalgia, so much longing? Why would it all be washed in an immutable sadness, if he did not have something to deeply regret? "No," the fox replied, after some time staring out into a distant courtyard. He turned his gaze away, restarting his trek into the bowels of the structure. "I have no birth, and I have no end. I am the Jubi, an existence of energy." But Naruto couldn't believe that. "I think Kurama has more self-identity issues than I do," the blonde thought, exasperated. Which said a great deal, for he had many of those. Kyubi continued to pick his way through the empty, ancient structure, with a gait that spoke of familiarity. He seemed to know just which winding stone path to take, passing through the courtyards of water and white marble, gilded gold statues of ancient monks, mythical creatures, intricate carvings of epic battles between man and demon. Naruto wanted to stop and look at every small embellished carving and every twisting bench leg, but Kurama was having none of that. He appeared to have a purpose for revisiting such a silent place of sorrow. The fox also knew where not to go. Naruto thought he had jumped out of his skin when Kurama ducked low in a dark passage, and flaming arrows sprang out from the wall in his wake. But of course this place would be armed to the teeth and full of traps. At any rate, Kurama knew where every one of them was, leaping out of the way of flaming walls, dropping ceilings, and poison pikes. "Why are we here, again?" Naruto asked, frazzled, after they had barely dodged death for perhaps the third time that hour. "We are retrieving the staff of Hagoromo," Kurama repeated, sounding annoyed. Naruto huffed. "Did the guy really have to put all this stuff here? I can't believe how long it's taking." The demon fox snorted. "Do you truly think the Rakudo Sennin would leave the most powerful artifact of shinobi history lying about somewhere for vagabonds and thieves to find it?" He sniped back. Naruto gaped. "Most powerful? This is not the sort of weapon to leave for others to find. Why do you think he conjured a world behind a waterfall, a mystical fog, and a stone fortress to protect it otherwise?" The blonde silently reeled at the implications of this. So all this stuff of legends has just been to protect this thing?" "Yes," the fox answered, darkly. "The waterfall itself is an eidolon only a very powerful sorcerer could break. Behind it the crystal waters are laden with priceless jewels and treasures, but these too are an illusion, meant to ensnare the greedy thieves who might try their luck at retrieving them. So it's a good thing we didn't get in that water," Naruto remarked, belatedly. "You would not have returned." Kurama said in agreement. "And the darkness from earlier? The curtain of shadows are also an illusion, an impenetrable, unbreakable deception. A genjutsu, I believe you would call it." The fox paused. The Rakudo Sennin was a master of all jutsu, but most especially of the illusionary arts. "Oh," said Naruto, greatly surprised by this. To be honest, he had always chalked up genjutsu as something not nearly as cool, climactic, or interesting as ninjutsu. It was strange to think that the father of ninja was actually a genjutsu master. At any rate, the blackness cannot be broken. There are very few who can come out the other side. This piqued Naruto's interest. "You seem to do just fine," he noticed. "I have been here before," Kyubi pointed out. "Otherwise, I would have had as little luck crossing the barrier as your companions did." "They tried to cross the barrier?" Naruto's brow rose. "Yes, to no avail. Only a true master of the illusionary arts could find their way through it. The Uchiha being one of them. The last remaining remnants of the Rakudo Sennin would surely have just as little trouble crossing through the plains of darkness as Kurama had. After all, the legendary eyes still lived on in them, though they had changed and warped with time. At any rate, all this just meant that there were perhaps 2 or 3 people left on this earth that could find their way to the ancient temple of Mahabodhi. None of them were the kind of people Kurama would risk gaining such an unbeatable weapon like the Rui Jingu Bang. He was fortunate that the sword, that should have rightfully been kept in eternal glory, here, beside the staff, had long since fallen into disuse and myth, until even the Uchiha had assumed it was but a simple weapon. Though the Uchiha may be capable, they lack the intimate knowledge of the terrain and the location to find it in the first place, so even if they theoretically also possessed the capability to break the illusions, they would not know where to do it, or even that they were there at all. Still, he was in no mood to entertain the idea of coming so far in his quest, only to be thwarted by something he could have avoided with just a bit of foresight. Better to retrieve the sacred items now before they could cause trouble later on. He finally made his way into the final chamber of the shrine, lined with elaborate columns of marble monks and spirits and gods, sparkling sunlight and gold. There lay the staff of the Rakudo Sennin, in all its eternal splendor, looking the exact same as it had the last time he had seen it, in the hands of the man himself. The fox noticed with great consternation that his hands were shaking ever so slightly as he moved to retrieve the staff from its final resting place. He scowled at them, consciously willing his fingers to listen to him once more. He had forgotten how greatly debilitating the human body could be. Kurama hefted the weapon into his hands, and seemed to appraise the staff in a new light, twirling it absently in his hand. He ducked, running through a few katas before feigning a deadly blow to the neck, testing the weight of the thing. Not too heavy, which was surprising. The thing was at least twice his size, and he had seen it grow and shrink far larger and smaller than this. Still, he had never actually used the staff, trained against it in the many arenas of the temple, yes, but never actually using it himself. It felt almost sacrilegious to be standing here, holding it. It did not belong to him. The staff was and always would be Hagoromo's, and the idea of anyone else, even himself, using it instilled within him a strange discord. Hagoromo is dead, Kurama reminded himself. Long dead. And what use did the dead have for their weapons? Yet, even more than the sword, the staff was forever immortalized in his mind as an extension of the great sage himself. He remembered Hagoromo teaching his sons the art of the sword, and allowing them to use it in practice. He had even let Kurama wield it, but he had never once offered up his staff. It feels powerful, Naruto remarked, after they had both stared at the Shikujo in silence for some time. More than you will ever know, Kurama intoned, gravely. And yet here he was, entrusting it in the hands of an Uchiha. An Uchiha far unworthy to wield the legendary staff, though in Sasuke's defense, he didn't think there was any Uchiha, or any person, who would ever prove themselves worthy, at that. Well, he most certainly wouldn't be handing it over to the boy now. He would probably accidentally hit himself over the head with it. The Shikujo was a deceptively difficult weapon to master, and required great perseverance and concentration. He unfurled a wave of chakra into the staff, until the great weapon retracted in on itself, becoming the size of a baton. Naruto looked on in bafflement as Kyuubi went on to tuck it into his belt. It looked like any other sealing canister, so wholly unremarkable and unguessed by the eye. For now though, I would prefer to keep the staff a secret, Kyuubi told the boy. So don't go around blabbering to your friends. I wouldn't, Naruto protested. Kyuubi snorted, not assured in the slightest. Kurama returned some time later, wandering out of the impenetrable darkness at the back of the immense cavern. He stepped right through it without even a hint of difficulty. They had tried for the past hour or so to find a way through the unnatural mist, but every time they headed inside of it they were always spat out in the exact same place they'd started. The fox spared them all a supremely dismissive glance. Are you in need of assistance? He asked coolly, surveying the sight before him. He was on the floor, sprawled out as if he had attempted to ram his way through the barrier and had been spat back out unceremoniously. Sasuke was covered in scratches. Yugito's hair was frazzled around her face. This was to say nothing of her utterly livid expression. Where the hell have you been? She bit out, scowling. I inspected the other side of the barrier, the demon fox relayed, coolly. And? He shrugged. There is a world with a temple. A world? Sasuke repeated, dumbstruck. But it was unoccupied. Yugito blinked once, before her scowl deepened. So we came all this way for nothing. Is that what you're saying? Kurama blinked, before motioning back towards the ancient pot standing sentinel behind them. I would say we came out rather well. He paused. Although I see you have had no success with removing the seals off of the Kahaku no Johei. He looked affronted. I mean, come on. How the hell were we supposed to know how to get that shit off? You're the only one here who has hundreds of years worth of experience in this, if you will recall. Yugito bit out, acerbically. Kurama tilted his head appraisingly. He had hoped that perhaps, somehow, Matatabi or Gyuki would have remembered something, but it was clear they were just as hopeless as their hosts. The fox was struck with a solemn sense of loneliness. He really was alone. He was the only being on this earth who could remember, the last remaining remnant of the great sage, and the dawn of the shinobi. Step aside, the fox commanded, stalking forward. The wards were quite old, but this only solidified their strength. These were not the kinds of seals that would wear with age. All the same, he was more than capable of dismantling them one at a time, peeling off the layers like gossamer smoke, the distorted air around it glowing a myriad of colors as he systematically cut his way to the center. The final seal broke with a crack and a splinter through the ground. His companions leapt back, surprised by the ink that bled out of the rock, bubbling out and forming intricate, circular patterns around the Kahaku no Johei. He opened one of his sealing containers, depositing the amber purifying pot there until he needed it. His companions were silent behind him. So, what now? Killer Bee asked. Kurama spared a moment to be amused at this, how easily these humans came to follow his lead without question. I assume you still have yet to master that sword. He gave a nod towards the treasured tool on the Jinchuriki's belt. Killer Bee nodded, confused. Well, this is a training trip, is it not? Kyuubi continued, exasperated. The purpose of this excursion was to improve your skills and abilities. Unless you think them sufficient enough, I see no reason not to continue. That appeared to be as much of an answer as anyone needed. It felt as if they had wandered their way through this land endlessly for years, but also as if they had just stepped into it moments ago. Naruto did not feel particularly accomplished, though Kyuubi had remarked on his progress, so it was clear he was progressing somehow, even if he didn't see it himself. At any rate, his companions had made the most of their waning hours, practicing dusk till dawn until they were able to wield their weapons without collapsing soon thereafter. Even though Yugito and B were Jinchuriki, and had more than enough chakra to use the tools, they still managed to drain them entirely of their reserves. Sasuke was improving with his new eye. Meanwhile, Kurama could wield all of them without even breaking a sweat. Naruto had only figured out the trick to it because he happened to share the same chakra coils as the fox. The demon had supreme and unshakable control over his chakra, to the point that he could give the weapons the precise amount of energy they needed to be used, without overshooting it and exhausting himself. Naruto explained that to his fellow Jinchuriki, but it turned out that understanding the problem doesn't always mean you were halfway to solving it. Holding such indomitable control over one's chakra was not as easy as it would seem in theory. Naruto knew the logistics of it all, and they all knew basic training methods to improve chakra control, but the blonde had a feeling even the most accomplished of Metagnin, who were already unanimously known as the most chakra-controlled ninja, would have trouble maintaining this much precision. The blonde Black Ops scowled into the distance. The morning was full of storms, but then, it always appeared disinterred with a certain illness, both tumultuous and unstable. Regardless of the clouding of clouds above, a gray light unfurled over the dying landscape. In the dark and bare branches the wind disentangled itself and spread wetness over the dusty earth. Naruto was almost ready to leave. He was having a hard time remembering what actual sunlight looked like. His companions were shifting awake behind him, but the blonde paid them no heed, cross-legged at the edge of the cliff and staring unscrupulously out into the ether as if it was the sole catalyst for his bad mood. Honestly, it had nothing to do with the weather, as depressing as it was. It seemed that the more he improved, and the closer he got to Kurama, the more he realized just how vast and infinite the channel between them really was. Naruto was not weak. It was almost impossible for him to be weak, now that his body was honed to the conditioning standards of the fox. And he could at least hold his own against the best Joun in the shinobi world had to offer. He was leagues ahead of his peers. And with the experience he had gained as a Black Ops came the inevitable precocity and strategic comprehension that all the great shinobi possessed, so he was not lacking in that regard either. Although he would not be quick to jump into captaincy just yet, or ever. He didn't think he would ever be as brilliant as Yamato. Yet regardless of all of that, the fox always proved to be more. Did he really have to train for a millennia or two to be the demon's equal? That was incredibly unfair, the blonde thought irritably. With that logic, no one could ever defeat the fox. It was with both relief and trepidation that he realized that this was not the case. Kurama was cautious by nature, yes, but he had deliberately gone out of his way to avoid certain people or certain events until strictly necessary. He wouldn't be so apprehensive if he was truly without equal. There had to be people still living on this earth that the fox found powerful enough to be careful with. Naruto shook his head, clearing his thoughts. These were thoughts far too deep for such an unpleasant and early hour. This was why he hated waking up so early, Naruto digressed. It gave you far too much time to think. The blonde stood up, turning around to watch Sasuke blow an unhelpful fireball onto a pile of branches. The Uchiha made a noise of frustration. Judging from the scorch marks around the pile, he must have been attempting to light it for some time. Yugito sighed, shaking her head. "It's too wet," she complained, pinching a lock of hair to scrutinize it with an uncharitable look. It looked damp and limp. Killer Bee scowled. "Well then what the hell are we gonna eat for breakfast, huh?" "I'm hungry." "You're not the only one," Yugito snapped, sparing the world around them a dour glance. "And there's absolutely nothing to catch around here. There's a river somewhere around here," Naruto revealed, drawing their attention. He shrugged at their incredulous glances. "I can hear it." "I guess that's helpful," Yugito snorted. "Where's somewhere? It better not be too far." Well, Naruto rubbed the back of his head sheepishly. "Can't be too far, right?" Fortunately, he was correct. The river really wasn't all that far. But the journey was long enough to elicit a litany of complaints from Killer Bee, and an increasingly sour mood from Yugito. Sasuke had already been in a bad mood. Naruto wasn't sure what he was feeling, an ambivalent annoyance, maybe. At any rate, they found the river without much trouble, but like the rest of this place it was paltry and not particularly noteworthy. Actually, it was more of a stream than anything. The fish were small and ugly, but at that point they were all too hungry to protest. All that training meant they needed to refuel on something other than ration bars and those ridiculous protein brownies Killer Bee had brought along. After that they began the grueling climb back up the ravine, out of the sea of mist and back onto reasonably safe ground. He was unprepared for the sight of a very familiar ANBU team, waiting for them at the top of the plateau. He visibly startled, wondering if he was hallucinating. He blinked again. No, definitely not. But then, why would they be here? The border is only a half hour away, Kurama remarked offhandedly. Naruto paused. Did you do that on purpose? Their presence at Yugito and be on edge, but Naruto waved off their concerns. You know them? He turned to the blonde. Yeah, that's my team, he replied quickly, a little thread of excitement in his voice. He caught a flicker of some kind of emotion on Sasuke's face, jealousy, maybe? He pretended not to see it though. He knew that the fact that he'd already reached the highest-ranking ninja status was a hard thing to accept for the Uchiha genius. He wasn't going to try to hide it, but he also didn't want to rub it in his face or anything. What are they doing here? Yugito asked mildly. Naruto scratched his cheek. Dunno. He thought on that. They're probably here to drag me back and berate me for being gone for so long. He laughed, only half joking. He hustled over towards them instead of beckoning the two groups to come together. It was probably best to just avoid that whole situation entirely. Hi! He chirped brightly, unsurprised to see that the entire team looked as if they'd just casually moseyed their way over here, and not as if they'd just gone through a mission and days of travel. You seem to be having a good time, Yamato observed, amused. Naruto laughed uncomfortably. Yeah well, we're getting things accomplished, I swear. Yamato nodded, appearing to take this at face value. Anything to report? He rubbed the back of his head. Yugito and B are nice enough. They work well together, and have been pretty game to work with us too. Actually, Sasuke and Yugito work very well together. He paused, thoughtful. He's doing better. At this, his captain raised a brow. Oh? Naruto shrugged. I think the time away from the village is doing him some good. I'm sure the training isn't all that much of a hindrance either, Yugao noted. Do you know what happened to his Genin team? At the mention of Sakura, Naruto stiffened. All this time away from the village had made him forget about a lot of the issues he'd been having lately, but he was also losing sight of what was really important to him. He couldn't spend the rest of his life wandering around in the ether. No matter how much he'd come to enjoy it, this journey had an expiration date. I know, he admitted after a long moment. Yugao made a thoughtful noise. Well, depending on how lazy Kakashi wants to be, it might be useful to have him get some one-on-one training. Naruto blinked. With Kakashi-sensei? Yugao shrugged. Or another jounin. Kakashi is a remarkably well-rounded ninja, with a lot of skills to teach. But that also means he doesn't exactly have much in the way of a specialty. It might be good for the Uchiha to pursue a concentrated approach, rather than a general education. To that end, he is also the best person to teach Sasuke about his Sharingan. Naruto mulled this over, nodding. And what about you, Naruto-kun? Yamato prodded gently. The blonde blinked. Well, he edged, feeling weirdly nervous. It was just Yamato. He'd actually become very comfortable with his captain and his whole team. And he'd never been shy or refrained from bragging about his accomplishments before. I've been making progress too, he answered, shrugging. Fortunately, Yamato didn't press him for more. That's good to hear. Do you have any kind of timeline or estimation of when you'll be ready to return? Naruto opened his mouth, and then closed it. He didn't know. Kyuubi took over smoothly, rolling his shoulders so fluidly it was as if Naruto was the one doing it. Soon, was his evasive reply. Perhaps in a day or two. And then, tilting his head, why? Was there something you needed? Though his tone wasn't particularly remarkable, Yamato narrowed his eyes anyway. He observed the demon coolly, before a pleasantly neutral expression made its way onto his face. It was not an expression that would look out of place on the mild-mannered captain, and yet there was something alarming to it nonetheless. No, nothing in particular, he answered, cheerfully. But it'll be good to have you back. An equally alarming smile lit Kyuubi's face at this. Yugao looked between the two of them warily, wondering what could possibly be going on beneath the surface. For all intent purposes the two were being incredibly polite. She didn't think she'd ever seen Kyuubi so pleasant. But maybe that was what had set Yamato on edge in the first place. He's been acting strange, you say? Hatake Kakashi scratched the back of his neck, looking more invested in his porn than he was in Yamato's concerns. Yes, the captain answered, snappishly. He had half a mind to grab that stupid thing by the spine and throw it out the window. And I was wondering if you could perhaps enlighten me to it. Kakashi laughed. Why do you think I know any more than you? Finally, much to Yamato's relief, he snapped his book shut and tucked it into his pocket, providing the ANBU captain with his full attention. To be completely honest, I had assumed you knew more about him than anyone. Me? Yamato blinked. He wasn't sure if he agreed. On the one hand, from an outside party it could certainly seem that way. He spent the most time with Naruto and Kyuubi, and to be fair he had probably spoken with the demon more times than anyone else in the history of Konoha. But he wouldn't call them conversations by any stretch of the imagination. The fox was just using him, the same way he was using all Konoha. But what Yamato wanted to know was why. He thought Kakashi might be his best bet, because it was clear the Hokage knew even less than he did. Perhaps the Sandaime could have offered some insight, but something told the Black Ops that the old man would have been equally at a loss as Tsunade was. The demon was an enigma, and there was no one who could possibly enlighten him. There was no one who actually knew Kyuubi. But there were certainly people who knew Naruto. He'd brought up a silencing jutsu the moment he'd finally cornered Kakashi in the Jounin break room, not in any mood to entertain his comrades or deal with listening ears. Nobody was around anyway, but it was never a bad idea to be cautious when dealing with ninja. There was no possible way for this conversation to get back to either of them, yet he felt on edge nonetheless. I saw you actually have a working conversation with him, Kakashi pointed out. Yamato opened his mouth to protest, but then Kakashi added, he listened to you. And after a pause, I still don't know how you managed that. I don't either, Yamato answered, candidly. He shook his head then, realizing this was getting nowhere. And what of Naruto, then? Has he spoken to you? We had ramen before he left, Kakashi offered. But the most important thing we talked about was the upcoming release of a new Ika Ika Paradise. Yamato heaved an exasperated sigh. Of course. Why do you think there's a problem here? Kakashi tilted his head curiously. By all accounts, this whole deal is working out splendidly for Konoha. Yeah, and Kyuubi's just a bucket of sunshine. Yamato agreed, flatly. He frowned at the Jounin. You don't that his behavior alone is cause for concern? You mean, his good behavior? Kakashi raised a brow. Yes, Yamato affirmed. Have you ever heard the saying, never look a gift horse in the mouth? Kakashi returned, but it was clearly rhetorical. He raised a hand, halting Yamato's response. I'm not saying there's nothing there, but either way, nothing short of an Ibiki-led interrogation will be useful. Yamato said nothing to this. And anyway, who's to say his behavior isn't beneficial to us? There was a dark glint in the Kapinin's eyes, one that did not go unnoticed by Yamato. He swallowed. They both knew exactly what Kakashi was referring to. You think so too, then? Yamato asked, quiet, even though the silencing jutsu was still up. You think it was him? Who else would it be? Kakashi challenged. The best of Anbu have wanted to overthrow him for years. Even the Sandaime had issues with him. I'm not saying he should have been killed, but he held far more power than most were comfortable with. The silver-haired Jounin paused, before adding, Danzo was a very paranoid man, rightly so. I don't think we've even scratched the surface of his undercover dealings, even with the ongoing investigation. What motive, though? Kakashi hummed, thoughtful. I'm not sure. And that's what made him so dangerous an enemy. Motives were normally easy to come by. Human greed, power, money, influence. They were all fairly par for the course. Only the deadliest had aims that differed. Even then, they were usually not too difficult to uncover. He had no idea what Kyuubi wanted, what he was after. Revenge. But for what? His imprisonment? He should have come after Konoha, if so. The fox was dangerous. He was, perhaps, the most dangerous enemy Konoha faced. Even more so than Orochimaru, Akatsuki, or any of their rival villages. And what was worse, they had given the demon the prime position to strike at the heart of the village. He honestly doubted whether any of them would be strong enough to detain the fox if it truly came down to it. He hated to say it, but that impossible task might fall into the hands of Naruto. The boy seemed to exercise some amount of control over the demon and his body, and if they couldn't defeat the demon physically, then they would have to rely on Naruto to defeat him mentally. And that already seemed rather far-fetched. It was true, Naruto was a very headstrong, determined, and honest young ninja, but Kyuubi was a terrifying immortal demon of immeasurable strength. There wasn't much of a comparison. Am I interrupting something? Came a lethargic drawl from his left. Yamato maintained repose as he turned to face the new voice. To his total lack of surprise, the demon fox in question was leaning against the far wall, just outside of their bubble of silence. Speak of the devil. Yamato canceled the jutsu, stepping away from Kakashi. No, the captain answered smoothly. Just catching up. The fox raised an amused, cool brow, which clearly said how much he believed that. Nevertheless, he didn't appear to want to press the issue. When did you return? He segued suavely, giving nothing away on his features. An hour ago. The fox replied. The Hokage wished to see me. And you actually answered the summons? He thought, surprised. What for? His scrutinizing gaze slid from Yamato to Kakashi. She wanted a report on the inter-village relations trip. He shrugged. Oh, well, that was fair enough. He had no idea why he had suddenly come under the assumption that Kyubi was planning to assassinate her at such a random interval. Kyubi had never once displayed any sort of intention, he reminded himself. Kakashi made a vague noise of interest. Well, if that's all, I really ought to see her myself. There's only so many hours I can be late before she puts me on guard duty, you know. Yamato scoffed. You passed that mark a long time ago. But he made no move to urge the Kapinin to stay. Kyubi made even the most confident of ninja uncomfortable just by being in the same room as them, but something told Yamato that Kakashi's disquiet with him was far more personal than that. It must be difficult to separate Naruto, his loud-mouthed and exuberant student, and Kyubi, the demon that had rampaged the village and killed his sensei. Yamato turned his attention back to his subordinate. Well, if you've already spoken to her, why did you need to see me? He raised a brow. Kyubi blinked at him. I was under the impression I was supposed to inform you of my presence in the village. He deadpanned. Oh. Well, that was true. Oh. Yamato said, at length. Well, thanks for that, I guess. But I don't even want to know what sort of exhaustion you've put Naruto through, so I suggest you get some rest. Yamato could imagine this going two ways. Either Kyubi would take offense to this, or he would have no discernible reaction. The demon fox didn't appreciate being ordered to do things, but at the same time he wasn't the type to lose his temper. So Yamato shouldn't have been surprised when Kyubi simply blinked at him, before disappearing in a plume of smoke. Well, that went well. In the resonant and dying evening a small form darted through the trees. Half of the moon anchored between two mountains, a turning, wandering light that illuminated the forest in small spaces of color. It was unnecessary. The demon could see perfectly fine in the darkness. The night fluttered uneasily around him. After some time the demon flew through the trees to land in a small clearing of foliage. There was nothing to mark it as significant. In the dark canopy the wind unwinds, disturbing, mysterious and familiar. The singular figure disinterred in shadow and light stood silent and sentinel in the middle of the clearing, gazing upwards. He always seemed to find his gaze drawn to the moon. Not this moon, though. Not even the moon in the speckled night sky. He had a secret softness for the morning moon, a white conflagration upon a forge of blue metals. Finally another shape dropped from the sky. Its plumage was dark like ink, but one bleeding red eye blinked at him in the night. The demon turned towards it, surveying the creature with a look of distaste. He was not fond of birds. The bird cawed once, before erupting into a winterstorm of feathers. In the spaces between the moonspill and the falling darkness, a familiar figure emerged. His spinning red eyes met the demon's. I hope you called me out here for an actual reason. I thought I made it clear that I kept my promises. The demon smiled. Are you still so adverse to trading information with me? The Uchiha narrowed his eyes. Yes, I'm sure you keep your promises, the ones that benefit you, at least. Trading information with you is beneficial to me, Kyubi returned. So you've no need to worry about that. What information did you want? The demon was quiet for a moment. There's a Jinchuriki in the far west, the Chome, I believe. You believe correctly. What information do you have on it? The Uchiha appraised him carefully, as if wondering why the fox would be so interested. The Chome currently resides in Takigakure, he answered, after a beat. Its Jinchuriki is said to be a young girl. Genin. She is very well guarded. Kyubi raised a brow. Adequately well guarded, the Uchiha amended. No guard would ever be of particular difficulty for the Akatsuki. The Akatsuki intend to capture her soon. Do you know which operatives will be sent? Haiden and Kakuzu, most likely. They're already in the area for unrelated reasons. The demon frowned. How long? Until they catch the beast? Itachi tilted his head. Kyubi nodded. I'm not sure. The Uchiha admitted at length. But I cannot imagine it will take them very long. The mission they were sent on won't last longer than a week. A week? Kyubi muttered. What do you intend to do? Well, I certainly don't intend for any more of the Jinchuriki to fall into Madara's hands. He retorted. I'll simply have to take her first. The Uchiha looked vaguely alarmed. My involvement in this cannot be revealed. Kyubi smiled. Neither can mine. But the timing will be suspicious nonetheless. Don't worry about that. The fox waved his concerns off. I will retrieve the girl, and make it look legitimate. The Uchiha did not look very convinced, but he had to acknowledge that the fox was cunning and swift. If he said he had a plan, then he most likely had a plan. I suppose I will simply have to take your word on it. Like I said, the demon smiled again, dark and full of teeth. I keep my promises. You fucking fox. The Hokage scowled irately. Do you have any idea what time it is? 3 hours until dawn, the fox returned smoothly, jumping off the windowsill. And if you are still awake, You must have the intention of staying awake until then. Swanda scowled further. You're still interrupting me, she pointed out. It was true, and there were at least 5 stacks of paperwork to prove this. Then hopefully this will go quickly. The Hokage narrowed her eyes, pushing away from her desk to face him. The demon did not say anything, leaning against the window. She raised a brow. Are you going to tell me what you want? She challenged. Or do you want to stand there all night? I want to take sabbatical. You just got back. Tsunade returned, deadpan. Yes, and the village functioned perfectly well without me. He nodded in agreement. Regardless, you're still a shinobi of Konoha, however unwilling your induction may have been, and I can't have you kipping out on your duties without a valid reason. Who said I didn't have one? Kyubi retorted with a smile. I want to go to Takigakure. Tsunade was silent for a long moment. Do I even want to know? She wondered aloud. The Chome is there, he revealed, and she is in the most danger of being taken from Akatsuki. She is apparently a young girl, genin age. She is certainly an easy target for them. The Hokage's eyes widened. The Akatsuki? She repeated. She closed her mouth, searching him closely. And just how do you know this, anyway? Kyubi shrugged. I have my resources, he edged, in a tone that meant he had no intention of ever revealing them to her. And they are sources to be trusted. Ask that perverted hermit of yours if you wish, he'll tell you the same. So there's a young, relatively untrained, and helpless Jinchuriki there, Tsunade began. How exactly do you intend to go about rescuing her? But the fox had already come up with a plan for that. I'm going to take her out of the village. You say that like it's an easy feat, Tsunade responded, incredulous. While we're not enemies with Waterfall, I wouldn't call us friends. You'd need a valid reason to take her. I'm not kidnapping her, the fox replied, amused. The woman made it sound like he intended to sneak into her room in the dead of night and grab her in a black body bag. The Chunin exams are a valid enough reason, don't you think? The Chunin exams, Tsunade repeated, flatly. She's around that age. Kyubi noted. Of course she would take them, and they are being held in Sunagakure, are they not? It would be perfectly reasonable of her to leave her village for early some training before heading to Suna. Tsunade looked as if she would protest, before she closed her mouth, leaning back thoughtfully. As usual, the demon came up with the most outlandish yet believable scheme. There was certainly an element of credibility to this absurd plan of his. The yearly Chunin exams weren't that far off, and many genin do leave for intense training during the period before them. But how would the actual act of enrolling her into the exams even work? Takigakure had few shinobi to begin with. It was incredibly small for a hidden village. Small and reclusive. Even more than that, Takigakure had very few children. This Jinchuriki was probably one out of a handful of genin. I see. Tsunade hummed, scratching her chin. So you mean to get to her before the Akatsuki, yes? That is the general plan. Kyubi agreed. Well, I think your idea is solid, she acknowledged. You can take the sabbatical. I'm assuming it won't be a long one. A week or 2 at most. The fox answered. Good. When you come back, you can start your new position as a genin sensei. You will of course take the occasional mission or 2 with your team, but your priority will be to train your team. For once in the relatively short time she had known the silent and impassive demon, she had never seen so much emotion on his face. She was secretly quite pleased with herself. He was shocked into stunned silence. His mouth opened uselessly. Excuse me? Your reasons are valid, Tsunade said, smiling cheerfully. And judging from the success of your last little trip, you are clearly capable of teaching. Not to mention, Naruto is great with kids. None of that explains why you want me to be a genin teacher, the fox pointed out faintly, with wide eyes and a voice low with hysteria. Technically you need a team of 3 for the Chunin exams. Chunin are passed on individual merit, of course, but there is an element of productivity and teamwork that needs to be assessed as well that makes the teams mandatory. But there's nothing that says genin from other countries can't be on the same team. After all, it is a multi-village exam, so genin from every country can pass. She smirked. And we have plenty of genin here to fill up the rest of your 3-man team. The fox appeared at a loss for words. After long moments to digest this, he frowned. And you have no compunctions on letting a demon mold the minds of your young, susceptible shinobi? Tsunade laughed. Like you're not just going to fob this all on Naruto, she pointed out. Well, that was true. Kyubi had no intention of wasting his patience and time with such useless endeavors, so he was definitely going to make Naruto be the one to teach them all the time. Tsunade would not tell the fox this, but aside from that she didn't really believe that the demon would mold the genin for his own nefarious purposes. He was not an Orochimaru. She actually had a feeling he would be a very good teacher, unwilling, but adept all the same. For the second time that night, the demon had no response to this. He was still looking flabbergasted and in awe of the idea at all. Your team has a mission tomorrow, she continued. But after that you're free to leave. Just try to return in a timely manner, yeah? Kurama supposed it would have been ridiculous of him to assume he would come out of this without any difficulties. Between simply leaving in the night to travel to Waterfall or actually going out of his way to get approval from Tsunade, one of those would be infinitely less of a headache than the other. Kyubi was clever and manipulative. He had no problems prodding people into giving him what he wanted. But he should have expected that there would be some trade-off involved here. Truth be told, this wasn't the worst thing that could happen. She was letting him leave all the same. Letting him leave, and not asking questions about it. He supposed Genin were a small price to pay in that regard. But he could only imagine what Naruto's reaction to this will be. It was his first mission back, and something about it made Naruto giddy. This was absurd. He should not be this pleased at the idea of assassinating another group of ninja. All the same, he was excited to join his team again. It felt like he just fit with them. Like there was a place for him that was still there even when he left it for a really long time. He was ecstatic and excited and really, really fucking confused. A Genin team? He repeated, loudly. Are you serious? Why would I lie about this? Naruto's mouth dropped open and stayed there for some time. He didn't even bother to clear his gaping expression until Yugao spared him a curious look. He schooled his features back into something approaching ambivalence. Inwardly, he was still freaking out. I can't be a Genin sensei. Naruto protested. I'm practically a Genin myself. How the hell am I supposed to teach kids my age? You had not trouble in Kumo, Kurama pointed out. That was totally different. Quite honestly, Kurama didn't think Naruto would have any trouble with this at all. People liked Naruto, once they got to know him. Personally, Kurama found him tedious, grating, annoying on the best of days and downright irritating on the worst. Alright. He may be exaggerating some, but the point was that Naruto charmed everyone he met. Those Genin would probably follow him with stars in their eyes after a day or two. I fail to see how. Kyubi sniffed. You are worrying over nothing. Naruto sputtered hotly. He cursed under his breath. Why the hell didn't you tell me about this earlier? What have I told you about telling me things? You know, keeping me informed? I'm telling you now. That is totally besides the point. To be honest, this event only came up recently. As you know, I intend to travel to Waterfall and retrieve the Jinchuriki. The little girl, yeah. Naruto nodded. Kyubi had told him about his plan earlier. He was in staunch agreement with this. For once, he and the fox actually seemed to agree on something. They had to save that girl before the Akatsuki killed her and extracted her demon. The most plausible way to get her out of the village without raising suspicion is to use the Chunin exams as a ruse. The demon explained. Although you do not need a team to pass the exams, you do need one to enter it. Your Hokage so insightfully suggested that the easiest way to go about it would simply be to form a team for the exams. Which means we'll be teaching Genin on how to pass the Chunin exams. Naruto said, slowly. Yes. He made a strangled noise. I never even passed those exams. How the hell am I supposed to train someone to pass them if I've never even taken them? Those tests are meant to emulate real situations that shinobi encounter. You have more than enough experience in real-life situations. I don't think that will be a problem. Naruto pouted. Hell. Kurama was right on all accounts. Still, he didn't want to teach Genin. What if he ended up with Sakura? His stomach fell. He had no idea how to feel about that. At least he wouldn't have to worry about teaching Sasuke. The boy was already a Chunin. He hadn't seen much of the Uchiha since their return to Konoha. As the boy had been whisked off by Kakashi soon after their arrival, he could only imagine Sasuke's reaction to this. He would probably laugh in his face. Kakashi too. I guess, he agreed after a long moment, lost in his thoughts. It probably wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. And though he may protest it, Naruto didn't think Kyubi was all that opposed to it either. His trip to the temple had been enlightening, to say the least. Not the actual event itself, but the dreams and thoughts that followed thereafter. The fox did not know that they shared the same dreams. It may be impossible to tell what Kurama was thinking from the surface, but his dreams gave way to a character that was very unlike what Naruto would have imagined. The fox was a student himself, once upon a time. He trained in those temple halls. He had felt conflicted, ill at ease, and unsure of himself. He was not always a perfect and indomitable creature of composed control. Actually, he was not at all like anyone thought him to be, Naruto included. Contrary to popular belief, the fox didn't seem to hate humans. If anything, he either held them with indifference or with an ambivalent fondness. The Rakuto Sennin was human. And more importantly, so were his sons. And Kurama was very close to them. Or at least, one of them, the one that Naruto always saw in his mind. There were some memories that would drift over him at night, full of sadness and longing. Naruto wondered if there was a time when Kyuubi actually wanted to be human. Of course, humans nowadays he found mildly distasteful. All the same, there was a time in his life when the fox was actually quite close with humans. And as for his motivations, well, Naruto had yet to make much headway on that. The fox had said once that he fought for revenge. Naruto didn't doubt that, but he also didn't think that revenge was all there was to it. There was something very personal about the cold, single-minded determination the demon possessed. Something that he cared for very deeply. The blonde was pulled out of his musings when Yamato announced that they were stopping for the night. It would only take them a few more hours to reach their destination, but it was better to arrive in the morning when they were well rested and ready for battle. His team moved about. Tawa called first watch. As always, Koga had already left for firewood. Yugao was rummaging around in her pack for ration bars. Yamato had made himself a wooden bench, and had pulled out his sword for cleaning. It was all at once both very familiar and very strange. He had traveled with Bee, Yujito, and Sasuke for so long that he had become accustomed to their habits. He shook his head, making to start on his own routine. He failed to notice his captain's eyes on him, so busy trying to pretend everything was normal. Fortunately, he didn't have to pretend very long, for his head snapped up with the distant sounds of movement in the shadows. He stilled, looking into the Atramentus forest. Those movements did not sound like the local wildlife. It only took a long sniff to the air and an acknowledgement from Kyuubi to confirm it. Definitely not a pack of deer. Naruto turned towards his captain, who clearly had sensed it too. The fox took over in the space of a second, raising a cool brow at the other Anbu, as if to ask for orders. Tawa was doing the same. "Stay at camp," he said to Tawa and Yugao. And then he gestured to Kyuubi, "You're coming with me." The fox nodded, and then the two were darting out into the trees. He wasn't entirely surprised to see that there was an enemy scouting party in the area. They were in enemy territory after all. Killing a scouting party would draw attention towards them, but at this point their only options were to kill the party to stop them from returning or have them reveal that there were Konoha Anbu in the area. An MIA scouting party would rouse suspicion regardless, but at least this way they could buy enough time to wait until morning before completing their mission. The enemy had no time to react to their preemptive strike. Within moments Kyuubi and Yamato had killed them all off, swords and melee attacks only, to keep their chakra presence unnoticed. Kurama had not spared much thought on why Yamato had chosen him to accompany him on this, but it became apparent that there was a reason for it when Yamato made no move to leave the scene. Kyuubi slid a sidelong glance his way, saying nothing. It was clear Yamato had a reason for calling him out here, away from their team, so he simply knelt on the ground and began to clean off his sword while he waited for the captain to say something. He grew a bit irritated when it became obvious that his captain had a reason to bring him out here, and it was just as obvious that he had no intention of enlightening the demon. "I'm assuming you didn't call me out here for a moonlit walk through the forest," he started, wryly. Yamato didn't even bother to remark on that. He stood some paces away, scrutinizing the demon closely. Kyuubi met his gaze without fear, wide spinning eyes giving nothing away. "What are you up to?" he asked finally. The demon raised a brow, gesturing to the blade he was cleaning. Yamato snorted. "You know that's not what I'm referring to." Kurama shrugged, looking back down at his blade. "Why do you think I'm up to something?" Inwardly, he wondered why his captain chose now to confront him about it. It was clear that Yamato was suspicious of him, but he had held his tongue up until now. Yamato turned dark, searching eyes toward the demon. Searching, but not accusing. "You've been far too complacent not to have a secondary agenda." Kyuubi did not look up, kneeling down as he cleaned his blade, and after, holding it up to the moonlight to observe the metal. "I thought that would be the foregone conclusion." "It is," Yamato agreed. "But I must admit, I'm rather interested to know, whatever it is, why exactly did Danza have to die because of it? You're being rather curious," Kyuubi remarked, neither confirming nor denying his part in that whole affair. "You're not denying it," Yamato pointed out. "Why would I?" The demon stood, finally meeting his eyes. He didn't know what it was he saw in them, some sort of indomitable energy, inert, but only in this moment. They were enrapturing somehow. They would ensnare him if he wasn't careful, this strange Sharingan. Greater men had fallen into its trap before. Well, assassinating an esteemed elder of Konoha might just be considered a criminal offense. Noted the Black Ops captain, dry as a bone. "But you wouldn't be the one to indict me," Kyuubi returned, matter of fact. No, of course he wouldn't. Whatever Kyuubi was up to, Naruto didn't deserve to suffer for it. The two shared a very deep and complex relationship that he wouldn't even dare touch with a 10-foot pole, lest he wanted to incur the wrath of a severe headache. But this did not mean Naruto was the Kyuubi, that he should be roped in with whatever machinations the demon had in mind. If anything, Naruto probably knew even less than he did. But Kyuubi never did anything without a reason. Even now, he had no obligation to humor Yamato, but he was doing so anyway. No, I wouldn't. Yamato agreed at length. But that doesn't mean I'm going to let you run around unchecked. Kyuubi blinked at him then with large, luminous eyes. If this was his attempt at an innocent look, it was sorely lacking in finesse. What have I ever done to deserve such suspicion? Nothing, and that's the problem. The fox raised a brow. You've been incredibly non-confrontational ever since that seal broke. Yamato observed. You could have ran for the hills and reveled in your freedom, but you didn't. You could have went on a slaughtering rampage, but you didn't do that either. Kyuubi didn't reply. He merely cocked his head, as if to show a passing indifference. That you haven't done anything is far more concerning than any homicidal spree you could have embarked on. Ended the Mokutan user, darkly. It means you have a reason for lying low. The blonde Anbu stood then, sheathing his sword and returning it to his belt with what Yamato thought to be fond affection. He made a non-committal noise. Why does it matter to you? Was the enigmatic response. I'm no threat to Konoha. At present. He added, low. Kyuubi shrugged. There was a beat where neither of them said anything. Why so interested? The fox turned to him, expression appraising. And why now? You've never been all that concerned with my dealings before. I can't have a vested interest, retaliated Yamato. Kyuubi barked a laugh. In me? And then he shook his head, a quiet smile on his face. Or, are you speaking of Naruto? Yamato paused, before deciding to be truthful. In both. This seemed to hold the fox in a stunned, suspended disbelief. His demeanor changed then, and he turned fully to steady Yamato, scrutinizing him contemplatively. It was difficult to discern what the fox was thinking from his inscrutable features. It was also difficult not to fidget under the deadly gaze. It felt as if the demon had reached into his very soul, opening it up in his hands to peruse the contents. You've nothing to worry about. The fox dismissed, after a long beat. Was that supposed to be reassuring? He shrugged. What? Do you want an oath from me? He returned, acidulous and sarcastic. Yes. Yamato answered, serious. The demon observed him for some time. Yamato wondered if he was being tested right now. And if so, was he passing? Or failing? Konoha means nothing to me. The demon stated, flatly. I have dozens of reasons to want to see that village razed to the ground, but to be candid, none of them are truly enough to motivate me to do so. I hold the place in such low regard that it is in no danger from me. Still, if it suits my purposes, I have no problems in protecting it. Yamato blinked. That was perhaps the most straightforward, explanatory answer he'd ever gotten from the fox. And one that, perhaps, he should have expected. Kyuubi's dismissal of Konoha came from a genuine indifference to the village as a whole. He probably wouldn't ever attempt a legitimate attack, if only because he held the place with such impartial indifference that he wouldn't want to needlessly waste his energy. And if there was one thing Yamato could count on, it was the fox's dogmatic conservation of his energy. It was Yamato's turn to pick apart the demon. I have to admit then, I'm at a loss, he said, truthfully. If that's not your aims, then what are they? To his total lack of surprise, the demon did not answer. His returning smile was particularly cruel. I already told you that Konoha has nothing to do with them, the fox pointed out. What do you care, if your village is safe? He shrugged. You're my subordinate, he said, like that explained anything. Kurama shook his head, silently marveling once more on Naruto's innate ability to inspire such fervid loyalty in so many people. He couldn't even pinpoint what it was in particular that made the blonde so amenable to everyone, and he had been trying to do so for some time. His ANBU captain cared enough about him to accost Kurama and interrogate him on his dealings, not out of concern for his village, but out of concern for Naruto's well-being. The demon fox's lips twitched, this time with no malevolence to speak of. I'll remind you that I'm more than capable of taking care of myself, he noted, amused. Yamato raised a brow. That's true, he allowed at length. Call me a nagging mother hen all you like, but I still would prefer to know what you're up to. Kyuubi's expression turned particularly bemused at that, both brows shooting up in surprise. Yamato sighed then, exasperated. Maybe he was being a bit too ambitious with this. What? Did he expect the demon fox to divest his most intimate secrets? Although I suppose if you're not in any immediate danger then I don't need to know much else. The fox remained silent for a long beat. "I am not in any immediate danger," he said, in a low voice. "But I do intend to take sabbatical to Waterfall." This, Yamato was most certainly not expecting. His eyes bulged. "What? Waterfall?" Kyubi repeated, patiently. "I plan to go there." "Yes, right, but," Yamato sputtered. "Why? Why Waterfall?" And then, like this also wasn't completely insane, "I intend to find the Jinchuriki there." Kyubi tilted his head, innocently. Yamato looked at him blankly. Why would Kyubi want to find another of the Jinchuriki? He had horrifying apocalyptic scenarios flash through his mind, before he decided to think rationally on this. Why the Jinchuriki? Well, if my calculations are correct and she's around the age to take the Chunin exams, I plan to train her to take the exams in Sunigekyo next season. He blinked rapidly at that. And you think the Hokage will be alright with this? She already approved it, Kyubi returned, much to Yamato's shock. Unfortunately, I think she intends to saddle me with other Konoha genin, but I suppose that is a small price to pay. Yamato wondered if, at some point in this conversation, he'd lost his goddamn mind. "So you are voluntarily becoming a genin teacher," he remarked, flatly. Most jounin spend their entire careers finding elaborate ways to get out of being a genin teacher. One only had to look at Kakashi to see just how ridiculous those schemes could get. And even Kakashi was eventually dragged into it. And yet here was Kyubi, perhaps the last person he would ever assume would have the constitution or motivation to teach small children, voluntarily subjecting himself to such a horrifying fate. Going out of his way to do so, actually. That appears to be the most logical course of action. Kyubi replied dutifully. He wondered vaguely if the fox was fucking with him. They were supposed to be tricksters, right? Why? The fox spared him an annoyed glance. "As I said, I intend to find the Jinchuriki and train them to an adequate level to pass the Chunin exams. The most straightforward way to accomplish this would be to bring them here. I'm going to assume the Jinchuriki from Takigakure would be a Takigakure shinobi." Yamato pointed out flatly. Kyubi raised a brow. "Are we in bad relations with Takigakure?" "Well, no. As I recall, the teams are only noteworthy for the first and second tests. Ultimately, Chunin rank is decided on individual merit, so why would it matter if one team was composed of members from different countries?" Yamato frowned. He was fairly sure Kyubi was breaking some rule somewhere with that, but at the same time, if there was such a rule he could not remember what it was. It was mostly a logistical explanation as to why teams were always from the same country. Genin teams were composed of 3, and genin teams always came from the same country. Even villages on good relations with each other wouldn't ever let their shinobi get so close to another, or ever even think about combining genin to form teams for the exam. Yamato had never heard of any multi-village team ever competing in the exam. But like he had theorized earlier, there weren't very many opportunities for that, so maybe this was to be expected. "What did Tsunade say?" he asked, pained. How did the fox always manage to get himself into the most ridiculous of scenarios? More importantly, what was going on in his head? "She approved," he replied, succinctly. "I'm leaving once this mission is over." Yamato's look turned incredulous. Finally he sighed. What exactly was he supposed to do if the Hokage had already approved? "You realize you haven't actually given me a legitimate answer to anything I've asked," he pointed out, pained. The fox blinked at him, smiling winsomely. Yes, he clearly realized this. Kyubi laughed. "Like I said, I am in no immediate danger. They may not be enemies with Takigakure, but he still couldn't imagine that a trek that far alone would be without difficulties. He couldn't help but wonder if the Hokage had thought of that. Kyubi was capable of holding his own, true. He was clearly a far more experienced ninja than anyone gave him credit for, but he was also just one person. And more than that, he was a Jinchuriki. He was just as much a target as that little girl. Surely she couldn't be planning on simply letting him leave? Just like that? Upon their return to Konoha, it became clear that the Hokage had no intention of letting Kyubi go to Waterfall alone, because they were apparently going with him. "I've never been to Waterfall, you know," Koga commented, with far more excitement than the situation warranted. Yugao shot an unimpressed look his way. "What exactly do you expect to find there?" she asked with a snort, flicking stray bangs away from her mask. "A magical mountain of gold? Singing quartets? It's not all that different from any other village. I heard they have their own special kind of rice noodle." Koga retorted. "It's supposed to be fucking magical. It's a noodle. Doesn't mean it can't be magical." Yamato sighed, looking away. He wanted to scold his team for being so unprofessional, but at this point it was probably a lost cause. The journey to Takigakure was dark, long, and boring. The forestry did a fine job blocking out every small speckle of sunlight, lending a timeless quality to the Sojin that made it impossible to tell what time it was by sight alone. Yamato spent half the time half-heartedly reminding his team this was a real mission, and the other half checking his watch. But if even Yugao was bored enough to humor Koga and argue over the magical state of noodles, then they were in dire straits indeed. The only person who didn't appear bored to tears was Naruto, but even then he seemed too lost in thought to be moved into any kind of emotion. He was also doing a fine job of ignoring his teammates and the situation at hand. He'd never paid much attention to any of the dossiers his team used for missions. If they were all going to be dead anyway, what did he care? Occasionally someone noteworthy would come up, and his interest would be piqued long enough to peruse through their file. But as a whole he never found them useful, until now. He knew so much about people he'd never met before that he was having a hard time sorting everything out, lost in his own head as he compiled together everything he knew about the Komiai's Jinchuriki. Phew. The more he learned, the more he wanted to meet her. She was around his age, but all the same he felt protective of her. It seemed her life hadn't been all that easy either, although the last ANBU spy to report on Takigaku suggested that she had a good relationship with the new village leader. Unfortunately, there was little to no information on him, a surprise replacement for a father who met an early grave. But he would be integral in this plan going off without a hitch. "Are you all right?" Yamato asked lightly, stirring the boy out of his thoughts. "Fine," Naruto replied tersely, rubbing his forehead behind his mask. "This is your first diplomatic mission. Being apprehensive is only natural." Yes, and that was the problem, wasn't it? It was only natural to be concerned over a daunting task that Naruto had never encountered before. He wondered how well Kyuubi would handle it. Kurama was actually a deft hand at political manipulation. Maybe because he was a deft hand at manipulation, period. "How do you do it, Yamato Taishu?" he asked, letting out a gusty breath. Yamato might not be the best person to ask, seeing as he was always far too amiable in diplomatic discussions. Everyone has their own way of going about it, he mused. Tsunade-sama tends to be straight and to the point. Sarutobi-sama was kind and understanding but still always held his ground. It may seem counterintuitive, but diplomacy needs to be authentic. That does sound counterintuitive. Naruto agreed, baffled. "I thought all politicians were misogynist, manipulative, uncompromising jerks." "Well, they certainly can be." Yamato chuckled. "But not everyone. Speaking for myself, I find that playing the hardliner always ends up backfiring." Yamato Taishu was too nice and moralistic for that, Naruto privately agreed. "But you know, Naruto, I have the feeling that you're going to do just fine." Naruto's brow furrowed behind his mask. "Really? Well, at least that made one of them." Meanwhile, Yamato studied the blonde carefully, turning over his conversation with Kyuubi in his head. Naruto didn't appear to always be conscious of what went on with the fox, as evidenced by his ignorance over the whole Danzo assassination debacle. The blonde was lost in his own thoughts, leaving Yamato to scrutinize him carefully. From behind the mask all he could see were large pools of sparkling blue, a far cry from the monstrous illusion he had seen on their last mission. What was that? A dojutsu? But as far as Yamato knew, Naruto had no Kekai Genkai to speak of. It was like nothing he had ever seen before, a visage that made all the hairs stand up on the back of his neck, as if in some sort of instinctual response. Kyuubi hadn't explained, and Yamato hadn't chased the issue. Maybe it was one of the fox's power. Maybe the fox was telling him something, without words. He doubted Kyuubi ever did anything unless it was with the utmost intention, so it couldn't have been a mistake. It had been just a glimpse, a flicker of inhuman eyes meeting his own. And yes, they were alarming, but also somehow familiar. Yamato missed a step, but recovered himself before his team could take notice. Had that been a Sharingan? He had heard that they could manifest into different forms besides the normal 3-tomoe shape. If so, then Kyuubi was definitely telling him something. He had killed Danzo, and he had done it for a reason. Yamato had speculated to Naruto that the fox could have somehow used the connection between the Nine Tails and the Sharingan. This was Kyuubi's way of confirming that there was, indeed, a connection. It appeared the fox actually had the Sharingan himself. Or was it really a Sharingan? He had no way of knowing. Yamato continued to study the back of Naruto's head, the blonde obliviously plodding along some ways in front of him. He worried for the blonde, obviously. However, he knew Naruto was capable of handling himself. This fact was getting more and more apparent as the blonde continued to grow exponentially. As self-deprecating as he tended to be, now that he had discarded the blustery, inflated arrogance of his youth, he actually had reason to be arrogant these days. He was growing into his potential more and more each day. He deserved to be Jounin, despite what he might personally believe. Not many children his age could rise to the occasion like he had done, not just meeting expectations, but blowing past them. Tsunade trusted him to lead his own missions, to train his own team. He knew it was easier to see all the boy's accomplishments from his vantage as captain, but he was not the only one who acknowledged Naruto's strength, and soon enough the boy would understand. It was both satisfying and yet disheartening to see. The moment Naruto understood his full potential was the moment he would understand just what sort of odds he was up against. Takigakure was small, but pretty. As well-traveled as he was these days, Naruto could wholeheartedly say it was the kind of place you tried to visit at least once in your life, but probably wasn't enough for a repeat trip, if only because it was so small. Naruto hadn't actually seen a waterfall yet, but he had to believe they were around here somewhere. But then, would it really be surprising for a hidden village to have a misleading name? His team was greeted with blatant, dumbfounded stares and a whole grapevine's worth of gossip. Word got around pretty quickly when a village was so small, he supposed, but they hadn't even been here for half an hour. The first thing he noticed about the village, aside from its remarkably small size, was the disproportional amount of adults to children. In Konoha, they were impossible to get away from, constantly screaming and making a nuisance of themselves at the most inopportune of times. But here in Takigakure there wasn't a single pair of wide eyes staring out at them from behind their parents' legs, no shrieking laughter piercing through the air. Naruto looked to be the youngest person thus far. However, Takigakure certainly earned its mark as a shinobi village. Most of the adults they did meet were down in rank, and looked quite formidable. Not that anyone was attempting to intimidate them. True to Tsunade's word, it appeared they were in some kind of alliance with Takigakure. Their paperwork went through easily with the ninja at the gates, and thus far they hadn't been met with any opposition. Naruto was in for a surprise when he finally found someone close to his own age, and that person happened to be the leader of Takigakure. He was also more flighty than a scared bird and twice as fearful of the world at large. Yamato managed to get him to calm down easily enough, throwing that disarming smile of his around like a lethal weapon. Now that he wasn't startled, Shibuki actually seemed to be quite a shrewd and level-headed leader. "I know of Akatsuki," the boy leader said, stiffly, once it became the topic of conversation. Yamato arched a brow, motioning for him to continue. "One of our shinobi, Kakuzu, defected to the organization," he revealed, solemnly. "Aside from what little I know of his defection, I'm afraid I have no other information on them. Our spy networks, in conjunction with Kumogakure, have enough to put together a reliable picture," Yamato replied. "And unfortunately, what we know is nothing good. They operate a small, but incredibly efficient team of missing nin from around the hidden countries. Their motives do not appear to be influenced by political or monetary decisions." Naruto cast a quick side glance at his captain, before averting his eyes back to his tea. It appeared Yamato was not going to reveal all of what they knew, as he had yet to come to the subject of Jinchuriki. But withholding information at this point was probably a perceptive course of action at this point. Despite being peripheral allies, Takigakure's status in the greater scope of hidden village politics was unknown. For all they knew, they could be conspiring with Akatsuki already. Naruto chanced to glance at the young leader in front of them. If they were, he doubted Shibuki was aware of it. The boy had no poker face to speak of, his emotions written clearly on his face as they transitioned with his thoughts. Naruto privately found this very endearing. He preferred honest people like that, and personally he thought a village leader should be as honest and candid with their people as possible, but he could see how it could be problematic to be so expressive, or be seen as naive. By his side, his team made no move to add to the conversation. The setting was casual. They were seated across from a low table, a beautiful garden in full view beyond the palace deck. Shibuki had 2 guards stationed by either opening, but was otherwise alone. Naruto wasn't sure if this was a sign of trust or naivety. Politics gave him such a headache, he digressed. And watching Yamato expertly maneuver his way through his part made him antsy over his own part to play in this mission. The ANBU team was here as delegates from Konoha to discuss growing international conflicts and to reaffirm their alliance. Hopefully by conveying the severity of the issue the Takigakure Kage would be more amenable to strengthening relations with their larger and more economically influential neighbor, and furthermore more amenable to allowing their prized Jinchuriki to train in Kanagakure and participate in the upcoming Chunin exams on a joint team. As far as Naruto could see, Fu was the only eligible ninja in this entire village. It was an uncommon practice for smaller nations to shuttle in their unranked Jounin-level ninja along with the Genin. A well-known and affluent country like Konoha could never get away with it, but a smaller, more obscure country like Takigakure certainly could. However, Naruto didn't see an honest and law-abiding leader like Shibuki doing something so underhanded unless it was absolutely necessary. After a lengthy discussion over yawn-inducing topics like trade regulations, border control, and migratory policies, Naruto and his team were finally excused from the meetings. The ninjas showing them to their rooms were friendly enough. They appeared to be more amenable than usual because the Konoha delegates were also shinobi, as opposed to the usual civilian diplomats. Naruto took the downtime as an opportunity to go out and scope out the village, get a better feel of the people and state of things. It was a far cry from Konoha, that was for sure. It was no bigger than Tanzaka Town, if he was to compare the two. Of course, Tanzaka Town was predominantly civilian merchants, travelers, and traders. Takigakure was almost entirely ninja. Even the shopkeepers he spoke with as he perused the only market in town were former shinobi. More conversation confirmed what he had assumed upon entry. As a small village made up of so many ninja, children were a minority. He saw a few now that he had wandered around a bit, but not nearly as many as in Konoha. Their academy was small, no more than a dozen throughout all age groups. Further conversation revealed there were 3 or 4 genin in the village, but they were all considered too new to even think about entering the Chunin exams. He didn't dare yet ask over the village's Jinchuriki, unsure of how the inhabitants would take that line of questioning. As it turned out, he didn't even have to. Towards the end of his exploration, he noticed a poorly concealed chakra signature tailing him around the village. He didn't need Kyuubi to confirm the unique energy as the aura of a Jinchuriki. It was easy to tell. Not to mention he caught a glimpse of bright mint green hair out of the corner of his eye. Not used to sneaking around, then. He took a quick stop at a ramen counter for some dinner, before eventually deciding he may as well confront his follower now. If all went as planned, they might even be able to leave before schedule. He stopped in the middle of a clearing past a line of trees, well-worn and obviously used as a training area. The tree trunks had telltale skid marks from kunai, and there were holes in the ground where wooden dummies stood. He stood forlornly for a moment, wondering if he should attempt the pretense of training. In the end, he thought that was probably unnecessary, given the circumstances. "You know," he spoke, idly, "for a ninja you're not very stealthy." There was a rustling from the bushes, as if the person sitting inside it took serious offense to this, but was trying not to reveal themselves. Naruto turned to the bush in question, giving it a nonplussed look. "I know you're there, you know. There's really no point in hiding." As if on cue, a bright teal-haired head burst out of the foliage, leaves sticking every which way in her hair. She pointed at him, rather rudely. "Unknown ninja! Who are you? Why have you come here? Speak now or... She faltered slightly when she was unable to come up with an adequate threat. "Well, whatever. You know what I mean." Naruto smiled thinly, amused. "I guess so." He shrugged then, tapping his forehead. "Are you blind? I'm from Konohagakure. I'm part of the delegation that came in earlier." It was a spectacle that was impossible to miss in this small town. "Oh," she said, lamely, lowering her finger. "Yeah." Naruto agreed, flatly. "Well, what were you doing in the village then?" She countered after a beat, folding her arms. "All the other Konoha nin are in the main palace." "So am I," Naruto replied easily. "But I wanted to look around some." "That's not a crime, is it?" "I suppose not." She sniffed. "But it is suspicious." He laughed. "I just wanted ramen." She narrowed her eyes at him, studying him closely. He wasn't entirely sure what to make of her. "I'm Naruto, by the way." He smiled disarmingly. "Who are you?" She watched him warily for another second, before finally dropping her arms and stepping out of the bush. "I'm Fu. I'm a Takigakure ninja." "I can see that." Naruto noted in good humor, taking note of her attire and her headband. "Well, it was nice to meet you, Fu. I should probably be heading back now." Fu nodded, hesitantly. "Oh, you too." Naruto decided to take a page out of Yamato's book and play a game of patience. There was no point trying to force his way into a friendship with Fu, just to get her to come with him. And anyway, he had already decided that he wanted to genuinely be friends with her, and he didn't want to ruin that by trying too hard. The second day in Takigakure brought along a lot of long talks and boring meetings. At least he had Tawa and Koga next to him in silent commiseration. The 3 of them were just not cut out for this sort of work, leaving all the talking to Yamato or Yugao. Tawa and Koga were a bit of a lost cause, but Naruto was truly interested in learning negotiations, despite how boring he found it after a few hours. Diplomacy was an integral part of being a leader, and one he had overlooked often in his youth. It had never occurred to him that the majority of the Hokage's job was inter-village relations. The Sandaime had been no great fan of it, tending to avoid having to deal with other villages any more than necessary. From what he'd heard from the Anbu and other adults that had been through both his regime and the Yandaimes, he had been a lot more active in inter-village affairs in his youth, but time and incidents had made him grow wary of it. Tsunade's council was a lot more open in that regard, angling for more alliances and trade agreements with other countries, a fact remarked upon by the Takigakyo delegation. I'll agree that by nature hidden villages are isolationist, Yamato had said on the topic. And that village autonomy is something to be respected. But Konoha has long since been involved in widespread trade with other countries, so it's no surprise Godame-sama wants to open up some of those old connections. Naruto couldn't care less about import and export taxes, but he had to admit he was learning a lot. He was a bit abashed to realize he had disregarded and underestimated the power of diplomacy in the face of brute strength and power. Once the talks convened for the day, he returned to the training grounds he had found the day before. It would be good to get out all his pent-up energy from sitting around all day, and he figured he may as well try to make more headway on his own mission while he had the time. If only his was as straightforward as Yamato's. He wasted time sparring with the Kage Bunshin, wondering if Fu would actually return, or if he'd have to go looking for her this time. It wasn't the most interesting or investing way to pass the time, but he had nothing else to do but wait around and hit half-heartedly at a mirror of himself. Fortunately, the girl didn't keep him waiting for long. He had just about gotten bored enough to start throwing around fireballs at an army of clones just to watch them flail around when he felt a flicker of distinct chakra lighting up behind him. Naruto pretended as if he didn't notice, continuing on with his unfair torture of his clones, much to their vocal protest. She circled around the training ground, doing a better job of keeping out of sight this time. The treatment sort of made him feel like when stingy cats stare at you from a distance before eventually coming up to sniff your hand. He wondered what it would take to get her to approach. It's not as if he could just hold out his hand with a can of tuna or something. He figured out her catnip eventually. All it took was the super explosion from a massive Rasengan colliding with his clones to ever come running out from her hiding spot. That was so cool! She cried, practically sprinting up to him. He would have been amused if he wasn't so relieved. Thanks, he said instead, not really sure how else to respond to that. Like, literally the coolest jutsu I've ever seen. She exclaimed breathlessly. Naruto wondered if that was an exaggeration, or if it really was the most unique jutsu she'd seen so far. The Rasengan was pretty flashy, if he was being honest with himself, and it was pretty unique. Still, he didn't know how to respond to that either. Can you teach me how to do that? Fu interrupted him. I've never seen a jutsu like that before. He actually couldn't believe his luck right now. You want me to teach you? He repeated, dumbfounded. Yeah, she replied without missing a beat. How do you do it? Is it some kind of wind jutsu? Naruto blinked a few times, still grappling with the sheer dumb luck in his life right now. Sure, yeah. Wind jutsu. Fu nodded eagerly. I know a couple wind jutsu, nothing fancy though. Naruto remained silent for a moment, taking stock of the situation. Nothing fancy, huh? He said finally, smirking. Well, the Rasengan is pretty fancy. Are you sure you have what it takes? Her eyes sparkled with the challenge. You bet. He tapped his chin exaggeratedly, making a non-committal noise. You're sure? Fu scowled. You better not be underestimating me just because I'm a genin. I would never. He grinned roguishly. Fu eyed him skeptically. Naruto had never actually taught anyone before, so it probably shouldn't have come as a surprise that he found himself emulating his own teachers. All right, I'll make you a deal, he announced. Meet me here tomorrow, same time, and I'll have a test for you. If you pass, I'll teach you the Rasengan and anything else you want. Fu nodded with enthusiasm. Okay. The next day, he produced 2 bells out of his pocket. Fu looked at him blankly. What is this? She asked, at length. The bell test. Naruto replied with a grin. The rules are pretty simple. You just have to find a way to take these from me. 1 is fine, 2 is better. How does that sound? Fu's gaze moved from the bells in his hand to him, a skeptical expression clouding her features. That's it? She asked, incredulously. That's it. Naruto affirmed. Her brows knit with concentration, as her gaze once again turned to the bells. Kakashi had used the test as a means to not only evaluate them, but coax them into working together as a team. Since Naruto was only training Fu, he decided to use it as an exercise to judge not only her skills as a shinobi, but also her ingenuity. He was going to train her for the Chunin exams regardless of how this test turned out, but he didn't want to make it easy for her. Predictably, she lunged straight at him. Ha! She cried in triumph as she tackled him to the ground. Her triumph turned to surprise when the Naruto beneath her turned out to be a log. Fu scowled, leaping back up and scanning the clearing. Naruto had disappeared. The blonde watched her curse liberally from his spot high up in the trees, watching closely to see how good of a tracker she was. He had sent out at least a dozen Kage Bunshin to run around in the forest as distraction. He wondered which one she would pick first. He had specifically made one of the bunch obvious and easy to follow, running through branches and leaving smudged footprints as he went. The majority were at least doing a passable job of covering their tracks. And 2 of them were using every Anbu tactic he knew. Naruto crouched on his branch, finding himself actually excited to see which path she chose. Would she start by observing the ground for tracks? Did she have some way of following scents or chakra signatures? Or maybe she could. Naruto swallowed a yelp of surprise as his tree shuddered alarmingly, before violently veering backwards. He used a quick shunshin to transfer to another tree, surprised to see the large pine he had just inhabited collapse to the ground with a thud and a climactic cloud of dust and startled birds. Okay, so that was pretty impressive, he decided. She probably has some way of sensing my Jinchuriki signature, Naruto thought, using another shunshin to put more distance between them. He certainly hadn't expected that. However, there was no other explanation. He had made certain to mask his chakra signature, scent, and presence. Not surprising, the Hachibi also exhibited some signs of intrinsic awareness to other-tailed beasts. Kyuubi agreed, surprisingly the blonde. Oh, finally decided to show up, eh? Naruto greeted drily. You seem to be doing an adequate job handling the situation yourself. Kurama replied, which was his way of saying he would prefer Naruto handle this himself. For someone so good at it, Kyuubi had a real adversity to teaching people for some reason. Bringing his attention again to the situation at hand, Naruto pondered alternatives to his current predicament. He had learned from B that the Hachibi could also consciously sense the other-tailed beasts. Certainly not with as much clarity as Kyuubi, but in close enough proximity B could track him easily, to the point Naruto had learned just to forego hiding away or attempting to get the drop on B with anything else but pure speed. He would have to train with Fu some more before he could discern how far a radius went, but for now it was safe to assume it was around the same as B's. He darted around the forest, using his own senses to track her location. She had followed his lead and dropped a few clones into the forest, and for now they were darting about on the trail of his own. The real foe was on his tail, the bright flame of Jinchuriki chakra tingling from behind him. Naruto smirked to himself, slowing down. She was pretty good. Definitely better than he had been as a genin. He skidded to a halt in the shadow of 2 pines, not in the least bit tired out but feigning as if he was out of breath. He slumped over dramatically, wiping at his brow as if to clear sweat from his forehead. It took her a couple seconds to catch up. Just as he had planned, she swung down from the trees to tackle the hunched-over figure. The Naruto underneath her blew up in smoke, turning into a log as it dropped to the ground underneath her weight. The real Naruto dropped down from the branch above, surprising the genin on the ground. Fu yelped unceremoniously as he grabbed her by the ankles and dropped her into the ground, a move he shamelessly borrowed from Kakashi. She gave a cry of alarm as he pulled her down, turning in his grip to swipe at him. At first he had thought it was just a futile attempt to get away from him, but it became obvious she had a plan in mind when a cloud of smoke erupted in front of him. He let go of her immediately, reeling backwards to get away from it. He thought it was ninja smoke, used to surprise him, but when he used quick jutsu to clear the air it still lingered. And then he blinked, and the whole world disappeared. Whoa, he said belatedly, staggering backwards. He rubbed his eyes, but everything was still completely black. If he couldn't feel himself blinking, he would assume his eyes were still closed. His second reaction was to send out a pulse of chakra to dispel any genjutsu. To his shock the blindness remained. Was he actually blinded? This is the Komiya's power, Kyuubi growled lowly, surprising him. Her tailed beast? Yes. So they were working together, then? He wondered what her relationship with her tenant was. Okay. Well, how do I? He may lack sight, but his other senses were in perfect working order. He could hear the rustling behind him, having enough time to duck under a swinging kick. He could feel the air current as she landed in front of him, sidestepping a punch that barely grazed his cheek, and throwing his guard up for her follow-up punch. He was holding his own for now, but he was literally fighting blind here. He dodged out of the way of most of her taijutsu, the kata not particularly difficult or original enough to catch him truly off guard. There was a rhythm to her swirling kicks and jabs, familiar enough for him to block or get out of the way, but not enough to stop defending and start attacking. He felt the air rush past him. He blocked the first kick, but the second roundhouse caught him right in the face. Naruto stumbled backwards, cursing under his breath. Well, she certainly knew how to enhance her strikes with chakra, that's for sure. Fu giggled. Not so easy now, huh? It's kinda hard trying to fight without your eyes, isn't it? He wiped his mouth, where he was pretty sure he'd cut his lip. Are you suggesting that you can only beat me if I'm incapacitated? He retorted with a smirk, straightening up. Fu gritted her teeth, and Naruto didn't have to see to know she was scowling. The genin grunted, unwilling to admit that he might be right. It simply wasn't in her nature to admit defeat, or inadequacy of any kind, even in the face of this jounin Anbu. Especially in the face of this one. Naruto couldn't be all that much older than her, and yet he was already a respected and accomplished ninja. She had this stupid urge to prove herself to him, one she knew was childish. This didn't stop her from wanting to anyway, to make him stop and look at her. She lunged at him again, withdrawing a kunai from her pocket. But she was 1 second too slow. With a flare of chakra, the murky, clouded color of the Komiai's dust over Naruto's eyes was burned away by a jujutsu she'd never seen before. Fu gasped as he caught her strike, before launching her upwards with a knee to her stomach, knocking the breath out of her as she went flying. She landed a couple feet away, grunting as she hit the ground. She rolled over back onto her feet almost immediately, crouched low as she scrutinized him with shock and trepidation. No one had ever broken out of the Komiai's blinding powder before. The effects weren't permanent, but they could stick around for a few hours. And with the perfect hit she'd landed on Naruto's face, she would have expected at least half a day. But the blonde was staring back at her with complete focus, his eyes a peculiar shade of crimson, with an annulation of rings spreading from his pupil. Those eyes definitely hadn't been there before. She only had a moment to stare at them in amazement, before the blonde vaulted towards her, sword unsheathed. Fu's eyes widened in alarm, her feet moving as her mind froze, throwing her out of the way. She grappled with her pack strapped to her leg, fishing out another kunai as she swallowed thickly. While her taijutsu was polished, she couldn't say the same for her kenjutsu. And it was clear within a few seconds of sparring him that Naruto was leagues ahead of her with his mastery of the blade. Despite the fact that she was sorely losing, having to revert to physically dodging out of the way and backtracking to put some more space between them, this was only endearing him more to her. Watching him with the sword was so impressive, he never seemed to miss a single step. Fu shook her head with a frown. If she sat here all day marveling over his form, she was never going to find a way to get that bell, and then Naruto wouldn't teach her at all. She gave a grunt as the breath was knocked out of her, Naruto flipping her right over and onto the ground. In another second her hands and legs were tied together, despite her attempts to wiggle out of his grip. Her eyes shot open when she heard his footsteps moving away from her, struggling in her bonds. "Hey!" she shouted. "Where are you going?" The leisurely pace stopped. "Oh, well, it's getting kind of late. I think I'm gonna hit the hay." Fu sputtered wildly. "You're just going to leave me here?" She gasped. "What about the test?" "Yeah, that. You've got until the day before I leave to try and take them from me, so don't worry about it. Suffice to say you failed today, but there's already tomorrow." Fu gaped. "I failed? Well, what else would you call this?" was the sardonic response. "Fine, whatever." Fu groused. "Just get me out of these things." Naruto laughed, the footsteps continuing again. "I'm sure you'll figure out how to get out of those, eventually." Her head shot up in alarm, as she wiggled around in the dirt to try and face him. Wait! What do you mean by that?" "Hey! Get back here! You can't just leave me like this! You jerk!" she yelled at the top of her lungs. He only continued to laugh. He wasn't sure what he had expected from his meeting with the other Jinchuriki. Someone a lot like him, really. Someone like Gaara, isolated, alone, somewhat unhinged. Failing that, he expected someone more along the lines of Yugao. Quiet, taciturn, hardened by life. In reality, his first expectation might have been right. A little too right. Fu was just like a Jinchuriki, one he knew very well. In fact, Fu was the spitting image of Naruto himself, that was to say, loud, obnoxious, arrogant and stubborn. Genin Naruto and Genin Fu could have been siblings for all they resembled each other in personality. He knew what this was about. Fu needed, to prove herself. A large and powerful hidden village like Kanagakur sends representatives to Takigakure. The envoy includes bingo book level Anbu operatives, highlights including Captain Yamato and the nine-tailed Jinchuriki, Uzumaki Naruto. They're the talk of the town in a small village like this, and it's not all that long until Fu hears about them. It's not a stretch to assume she's comparing herself to him. They're both Jinchuriki, both about the same age. Considering her relatively sheltered existence in this small village, she's probably always been the strongest in her generation. To have another Jinchuriki come in here, with some illustrious title from some illustrious village. Naruto sighed. Hopefully this wouldn't cloud her judgment for too long. He really wanted to see just what kind of potential she had. The talks continued. Naruto had his first speaking part since they arrived, trying to casually persuade Shibuki into letting Fu come back with them. Or at the very least, laying the groundwork to hopefully make him more amenable to the idea later on. I just don't see why Akatsuki is our problem, Shibuki was in the middle of saying. The conversation had once more returned to the matter, the topic left alone after a few brief remarks on it on the first day. It seems like an issue best left to the larger hidden villages, who have the resources to deal with this sort of thing. Despite the fact that the majority of our citizens are shinobi, that's still a small portion size in comparison to, say, Konoha or Kumo. That may be so, but Akatsuki is everyone's issue, not just an issue best left to those who can afford to fight them. Yamato countered. Obviously your contributions will be relative. No one expects Takagakure to have as many shinobi in the coalition as a Kanagakur or Kumogakure. Shibuki made a non-committal noise. It just seems like a bit of a stretch to me. It's preemptive, yes. Yamato agreed. But Tsunade-sama and Eisama have agreed that preventative measures are better than reactive, especially considering the losses that could occur. Well, now we've really come around to the issue. One of Shibuki's advisors interrupted. Their presence was most unwelcome as far as Naruto was concerned. Shibuki had went from a mild-mannered and pleasant individual into some stoic and unfriendly version of himself the moment they walked in. Naruto didn't know what sort of situation was going on behind the scenes, but he could infer it wasn't an amicable one. The other one nodded. Yes, exactly. Just what losses are you referring to? Fighting forces? Land? Economic prosperity? You stated earlier that they didn't appear to have any monetary or political influences, so what are they after? Akatsuki doesn't want your land or your money, Naruto found himself interrupting. The entire party turned to look at him, and he pushed aside a trill of nervousness to continue on. An attack from them could lead to casualties, but that's not their main intention. Shibuki was scrutinizing him closely, as if he hadn't even noticed Naruto was there until now. Is this supposed to sway me somehow? He brow rose in rhetoric. What exactly is their danger, otherwise? You're Jinchuriki. Naruto replied, flatly. Whatever amusement the Takagakure Kage felt disappeared at that, his eyes narrowing. What? They're after the Jinchuriki. All of them, including Fu. Steal our Jinchuriki? The advisor to his left hissed. What madness is this? They would dare? Cried the other. For what purpose? Shibuki spoke over them both. No one really knows. Naruto replied carefully, unwilling to relay Kyuubi's suspicions without any concrete proof. But whatever they do to them involves the death of the Jinchuriki, and the capture of the beast. Shibuki looked very pale at the thought, gaze lowering to the table as he pursed his lips in thought. The reason why Kumogakure and Kanagakur are at the forefront of this alliance is because they have already suffered an attack by Akatsuki. Naruto continued. Fortunately the hosts, myself, and Niujido, were able to escape capture, but it was a close call. We don't intend to let Akatsuki have another chance. His eyes snapped back to Naruto. One of his advisors sucked in a breath. You're the Kanagakur Jinchuriki? A part of Naruto was surprised that they were so surprised. But then he realized he hadn't actually told anyone, not even Fo, although he assumed she'd figured that out. Belatedly he wondered if he wasn't supposed to tell them that. This is Uzumaki Naruto. If Yamato was annoyed with him for introducing himself, nothing showed on his features. And yes, he is also the Kanagakur Jinchuriki. Shibuki looked shaken. Akatsuki tried to take you as well? Naruto was about to answer, but Yugao beat him to it. They attempted multiple times. He revealed. But luckily Naruto is capable of handling his own. Actually, I'm lucky that I have people looking out for me. Naruto amended quickly. I wasn't alone during any of these attacks, and I was lucky that there were people who were willing to help me, even risk their lives for me. He added, thinking of the Jounin who had intercepted Kisame and Itachi when they had went to Konoha in search of him. Fortunately Yamato seemed to pick up on where he was going with this, nodding slightly. Naruto is correct. He had a lot of support which proved to be invaluable. We cannot stand alone in this. They've already taken advantage of our fractured alliances, pitting enemies against each other for their own gain. The Takagakure leader closed his eyes, taking a breath. I agree that the matter requires serious attention, he said, solemnly. As Takagakure is one of the hidden villages that has a Jinchuriki in residence, we must act with caution. One of his advisors visibly startled. Shibuki-sama. Whatever resources you need from us, you will have them, he stated with great finality, much to irritation of the two men sitting beside him. Yamato simply inclined his head. Thank you. Shibuki looked grim, but determined. We can work out the particulars tomorrow. An excellent idea, agreed the old man to his left. Yes, the hour grows late. Perhaps we should retire for the evening? The other segued smoothly, smiling thinly. Yamato took the subtle dismissal for what it was, meeting the smile with a cheery one of his own. Of course. I'm not sure about all of you, but I find myself quite famished. Shibuki-sama, I heard Takigakure was famous for their rice noodles. Perhaps you could recommend us a place? Fu scowled darkly at nothing in particular, feeling sorry for herself and then feeling annoyed because she was feeling sorry for herself. She had once again failed to get the bell from Naruto, and today was the last day to try. She had underestimated him, somehow, even knowing he was a Jinchuriki, and knowing he was a Black Ops. He hadn't disclosed either of those two facts to her, but she could gather information just as well as any other shinobi. First of all, the only party of Konohanin to come in was a party of Anbu members, so it was easy to figure out what Naruto's rank was. As for his status as a Jinchuriki, she had the Chome to help out with that. She might not appear stealthy at first glance, but that was all part of her ruse. The Komiai's natural powers were centered around illusions and invisibility, something Fu had taken to heart. But even if she knew all this stuff about him, he still came out of it with the upper hand. She rubbed furiously at her eyes. Now was not the time to feel dejected. She should be coming up with another plan, not sitting around moping. Good ninja didn't give up. They kept trying until they found something that worked. She tried a lot of brilliant ideas out on Naruto, but none of them came even close to working. The blonde had a larger repertoire of jutsu than she did, had more precision with his chakra, had better swordsmanship and taijutsu, and had a few tricks up his sleeves like that jujutsu of his. Okay, so there were a lot of reasons why even her ingenious ideas fell short. But there had to be something else. He had to have a weakness somewhere. Fu pondered this as she walked home, scuffed up with dirt from her latest, and final, attempted to nab a bell from the blonde Black Ops, but no longer defeated in the least. Well, for one thing, she did have somewhat of an advantage now. The test was technically over, so Naruto probably thought she had given up. Not to mention at this point he must assume he knew her strengths and weaknesses pretty well, so if she played her cards right he might just underestimate her. Fu tapped her chin thoughtfully. Well, she did have one more skill up her sleeve. One she considered to be her best, and one she hadn't had the opportunity to show off yet. But that might just work in her favor at this point. Fu grinned. Still, it was a long shot, but it could work. But in order for that to happen she had to gather information. Fortunately the Konoha party had one more day of negotiations, set to leave at sundown tomorrow. That was plenty of time for some good old reconnaissance. Naruto eyed himself in the mirror, wary and alarmed. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen his strange Sharingan evolution, but it certainly hadn't looked like this. The first time it had manifested, all those months ago during the Chunin exam invasion, he remembered staring at himself in a similar position and scrutinizing the familiar red eyes and black tomo. It had looked like Sasuke's, a red iris with a ring about halfway from the edge of his eye to the pupil, 3 tomo strung around it. By the time he had been hunting for Tsunade, it had emerged anew. There were more rings, with more tomo. He hadn't thought it cause for serious concern, because at that point Kyuubi had revealed to him that his Jujutsu was not actually a Sharingan, but some kind of predecessor to it. And it had still looked similar enough to its original form that it hadn't really worried him, and everything still seemed to be in working order. But it was really starting to worry him. Naruto pursed his lips, leaning closer to the mirror and widening his eyes. There were 3 rings now, 3 tomo on each. Combined with his pupil, there appeared to be 10. He blinked slowly, observing as his pupil dilated as it adjusted to the light. As it grew the space between the rings thinned. When it contracted again the spaces evened out. When his eyes first opened the tomo circled quickly, almost too fast to track, before eventually slowing down as he kept them open. The process was oddly hypnotizing. He had no idea how long he stood there, watching himself blink repeatedly, but it was long enough to lose himself in a daze. He was thrown clean out of it by a rap knock on the bathroom door, startling him enough for him to flail backwards and land sprawled on the toilet seat. "Do you plan on staying in there all day?" Came a muffled voice from the other side of the door. "Just saying, I tried to be courteous and wait a couple minutes, but dude, it's been way more than a couple minutes." "What? Wait, that's not. He spluttered quickly. "I was just, I don't even want to know." Towa deadpanned. "But we're leaving in 10 minutes. Naruto smacked a hand to his face in horror, closing his eyes with an expression of pure mortification. "It's not. I don't want to know." Towa repeated flatly, before his footsteps marched their way out of Naruto's hotel room. Naruto sighed, scrubbing the hand down his face. Well, at the very least he would never guess what Naruto was actually doing. When he sat up again his eyes were back to normal, a clear, sparkling blue. So normal it was as if he had dreamed that Sharingan up. He squinted at himself in the mirror, wondering how to conjure it up. It always just seemed to happen. He had to admit, thus far the timing had always been impeccable, but all the same you would prefer to be able to access it on command. Whenever he was in combat, or whenever his senses were on high alert, it always seemed to manifest exactly when he needed it to. But otherwise it was like attempting to rouse QB when he didn't want to be bothered, utterly impossible. The blonde let out a huff of air, unlocking the bathroom door and stepping back into his hotel room. 10 minutes was probably a perfect amount of time to throw all of his stuff into his bag and pray he didn't forget anything important. The last day of negotiations had actually taken more out of him than any sparring with Fo could have done. On that note, he should probably start hunting down Fo, to initiate his plan to get her to come back with them to Konoha. She'd failed the bell test all 3 days, which was something he'd struggled a bit with. Should he go easy on her the last day so she would pass and become his student? Or would that end up being detrimental? In the end, he decided not to go easy on her at all, and despite her best efforts, which truly were quite extraordinary, she hadn't managed to get either bell. At any rate, this just meant that Naruto had to seek her out and propose his solution. He would teach her if she came with him back to Konoha. After that, he would have to find a way to convince Shibuki to agree, but he was betting on Fu to do that. The Takigakure leader had already agreed to help however he could with Akatsuki, mainly just to provide backup if needed and to report any suspicious activity within their borders. Their real sacrifice to the cause would be letting go of their precious Jinchuriki, and that was still up in the air. There was a polite knock on the door. "Naruto?" He answered vaguely, distracted by hauling all of his clothes out of the drawers. Yugao opened the door a peek. "Don't even say it," Naruto said flatly, before he had to put up with it. The last thing he wanted to hear was the talk attempted by an uncomfortable but determined to do the subject justice Yugao. "Tawa is a fucking liar." "What was he lying about?" she asked as she walked in. Oh, maybe Tawa hadn't went gushing to the rest of the team after all. That would be rather surprising of the other ANBU. Finding material to tease Naruto with was practically his favorite pastime, and Naruto had just handed him the gold mine. About, you know what, never mind. He finished shortly, narrowing his gaze around the room for the missing sock to this pair. It had to be around here somewhere. "It's nothing, really." He whirled around fast enough to give himself whiplash, acting on instinct. His hand sprung out to catch her by the wrist, where she was reaching for his belt. His eyes widened. Not his belt, but his other hand snapped to her throat, with enough chakra to cause the hinge to dispel. Fu blinked up at him, a sheepish grin to her face. "Gotcha," she croaked, around his vice-like grip. Naruto immediately released her at that, stunned into immobility. She landed back unsteadily on her feet, rubbing her throat with a grimace. Still, she was grinning triumphantly. Naruto simply stared down at her, still shocked. He had been distracted, yes, but all the same that was a great hinge. She must really have a talent for it, he thought belatedly. It took a lot to be able to control one's chakra signature to perfectly emulate someone else's like that. And it took a very observant shinobi to mimic the behavior of another. He would have noticed something off with Yugao otherwise. "Wow," Naruto said at length, still in awe. "That was a phenomenal hinge." Fu beamed at him. "Thank you." He recovered himself after a beat. "Although you know, your deadline was yesterday." Fu immediately deflated. "I know," she replied, glumly. "But I couldn't let you leave thinking you had beat me." Naruto raised a brow. Fu pursed her lips. "Well and..." She looked away. "And I had something I wanted to ask you." He leaned back, very interested in where this was going. "Yeah?" She scuffed the floor with her foot, eyes downcast. "I still want to learn the Rasengan. I'm leaving today, you know." He reminded her gently. 10 minutes, yeah, I know. She reminded him cheekily, grinning with amusement at his sudden scowl. Her good humor flattened out again, returning her to her maudlin and discomfited state. "Well, it was just... I was thinking." "Yes?" He prodded lightly. Her eyes shot up to meet his. "Could I come with you? Back to Konoha? Please? I've always wanted to go, and Shibuki said I could, even though he wasn't too happy about it, and I promise I won't get in the way or anything and..." Okay, Naruto cut her off hastily, before she could really get on a roll. "You can, okay? It's fine. I'll train really hard and listen to everything you say, and I'll be a really good student and..." She cut herself off with all the bluntness of a solid brick wall weight. "Really?" "Yes, really," Naruto returned, amused. Fu blinked her large vermilion eyes repeatedly. "Really?" She echoed. "Yes," Naruto said, amused. That's it? Just like that?" "Well, to be honest, I was hoping you'd say that." Naruto shrugged. Fu's mouth opened in shock. "You were?" "Well, yeah. If it's alright with you, I wanted to train you for the Chunin exams." It's part of the reason we're here, actually, he revealed with a sunny smile. Fu's mouth dropped even further. What? She pointed at him wildly. But you, the Rasengan, and the test, this whole time? She yelled at him accusingly. I thought it would be better if you came to the decision on your own. Naruto answered cheerfully. It wasn't entirely a lie. But all the same, Naruto couldn't have predicted a better outcome if he tried. This was perfect. She threw the bell at him. You suck, she declared dramatically. Do you have any idea what I had to go through to get Shibuki to say yes to this? I had to connive him with fake tears, and yelling, and threatening, and all sorts of things. And this whole time you were going to do it anyway? You would have had to convince him either way, Naruto pointed out with a laugh. At least this way was genuine. To be honest, I would have told you earlier if I thought you were a good enough actor to pull it off. He paused. Although considering how you fooled me with that hinge, maybe you could have. Fu's brow twitched. I can't believe you, she fumed. This whole time I was sitting here freaking out over this damn test, and it was all a fake to begin with. Hey now, Naruto chatted lightly, plopping backwards to sit on his bed. Just because it was fake doesn't mean it was meaningless. It was a good experience for you, and a good opportunity to assess you for me. She was still pouting, but unwillingly bit out, I guess. She looked up at him. But why did you let me think I'd failed? Well, you did fail, Naruto pointed out, to her annoyance. But my plan was to ask you to come with me anyway. Fu tilted her head curiously. But how did you know I would say yes? Psychoanalyzing. Naruto replied with a grin. Anyway, I figured the most difficult part would be to convince your Kage to let you go. But I could tell from the meetings that despite his desire to keep you close by, he wants you to grow and succeed first and foremost. And going to Konoha would be the best way to do it. Fu realized. Yep! Naruto grinned wider. It's great when things work out so well, huh? Maybe for you. Fu made to swipe at him angrily. He laughed and ducked out of the way. I was really worried. But in spite of her anger, Fu could privately admit his plan had actually helped her to think outside the box. She would have never come up with the idea of turning herself into one of his teammates to steal his bells. She would have just been thinking of ways to beat him in combat, even though it was clear that wasn't working. Would you have come up with your plan if you hadn't been worried? Naruto turned around, in line with her current train of thought. Fu blew a raspberry. I guess not. Naruto smiled at her, before shaking his head fondly and getting up off the bed, continuing his hunt for his missing socks. Well anyway, why don't you tell me how you managed such a perfect hinge? I know ninja who are considered experts on them that can't even get a hinge that close. Fu smirked. Well, you see, the first step is to study your subject with the eye of an artist. Naruto stood beside the rest of the Jounin sensei, finding himself stunned into silent disbelief. He was not alone in his shock, either. Just about every other Jounin in here was looking at Tsunade with varying expressions of incredulity or disbelief. He had been summoned to the Hokage's office a few hours after he'd arrived home from Takigakure, only to find the room already crowded with the familiar faces of the other Jounin sensei, and a few new sensei he hadn't been introduced to yet. Kakashi had given him a friendly wave, and Ebisu had grinned at him. Everyone else just looked surprised and bewildered by his presence. The trip back had been slower than usual with the addition of Fu, who had to be taught how to regulate her chakra for long-distance fast travel. Despite taking to him like a duck to water, she seemed skittish and shy in the face of his team. He wasn't sure why. His rank hadn't bothered her before. But maybe that was due to their shared status as Jinchuriki and similarity in age. It hadn't been awkward or anything, but he had found it harder to get her to open up to him because of it, and he wanted to use the time with just the two of them to solidify their friendship, before Tsunade threw two other genin into the mix. He needn't have worried though, because it appeared he would be spending a lot of time with Fu, because she was his new housemate. She swore up and down it was only temporary. Shibuki had given her enough money to start, and soon enough she'd be making her own money through missions and the like. It was only until she could find a place herself, and Naruto felt a little bad for the young girl who was all alone in a brand new city 10 times bigger than her own, so he let her stay. She hadn't even had time yet to explore the city fully, let alone start looking for places to live. With Fu taken care of, at least for the time being, his summons to the Hokage's office came with good timing. He was eager to find out who his other two students would be. But in hindsight, Naruto didn't know what he had been expecting. Some academy squirts, probably. It hadn't occurred to him that the genin he had grown up with and gone to school with for the majority of their lives, the ones who hadn't passed the exams, would obviously be the genin who were being shuffled around. Hokage-sama, forgive me if I am speaking out of turn. Guy coughed delicately. But do you truly think it wise to resort to teams in such a manner? Kurina's ruby gaze slid from her fellow Jounin sensei to her Hokage. I have to agree with him, Hokage-sama. These teams have been together for over a year now. They've begun to gain traction and they've had a long time to work on their teamwork, which is an integral part of being a shinobi. I understand that some amount of shifting around is necessary due to the uneven numbers, Asuma added. But this is breaking up a foundation that has taken months to solidify. Tsunade stared them all down with an inscrutable expression. I acknowledge your complaints, she began, solemnly. And I agree they all have merit. The office was silent as they all waited for the other shoe to drop. But I have to say, these past exams were awful. Konoha's teams in particular performed abysmally in comparison to the other countries, and a lot of that has to do with our approach to teams. Well, Tsunade wasn't mincing words today. Kurina looked like she had something to say, but Tsunade raised her hand against the interruption. Look, emphasis on teamwork is a good thing. Teams are important. Loyalty is important. Our teams were formed to cover the strengths and weaknesses of individual genin, which is a good thing. But genin are passed on individual merit only. Shinobi are valued on individual merit only. She waved a file in the air. From this far away Naruto could make out an indistinct photo attached in some kind of data chart. And what happens is we start to get genin with appallingly distorted strengths and weaknesses. Their strengths get stronger, and their weaknesses become glaringly apparent when they're removed from their team. There's a reason why out of the half-dozen teams from Konoha to participate, only one genin was picked. Naruto and Sasuke being exceptions. Naruto because he had been promoted well before the exams, and Sasuke because of necessity. At this, whatever disagreements any of them might have had died a still death. Well, apparently not all disagreements. To Naruto's surprise, it was actually Kakashi who spoke up. Hokage-sama makes valid points, but with all due respect I have to disagree. Relying on others is a necessary skill to learn and a difficult thing for shinobi to acknowledge, and that problem is only exacerbated by the current system. Despite the fact shinobi are valued on their individual skills, they are still always put on teams. Naruto's lips thinned into a terse line, an expression of discomfort shared by the others. They both made good points. Agreed, Tsunade returned shortly. But we're not looking long-term here. Despite starting in three-man teams, genin are judged on individual merit. Chunin are judged on teamwork. And yet, look at our system, genin are forced onto teams, while chunin are often taken under the wing of a single mentor. She sighed. If it was up to me I'd change the whole damn system, but it's not, so we'll just have to make do. I'm restructuring the teams because they've gotten complacent. Yes, teamwork is important, but as you all know it's very rare to stay on one team exclusively for a ninja's entire career. And right now our emphasis on teams rather than individuals is producing a stunning lack of productivity and advancement. As of now, our priority is to build strong, able shinobi. I want well-rounded genin to become well-rounded chunin who will have a lot to bring to the table no matter what team they're with. Do I make myself clear? It is important that they cooperate and work well together, but it is just as important that they are competent and capable as individuals as well. At the end of the day, Tsunade was Hokage. As far as the ninja population was concerned, her word was law. So despite whatever begrudging complaints any of them had, Tsunade's decision remained steadfast. No one was all that enthused about it though, Naruto included. The Hokage had asked him to stay behind after dismissing the rest of the Jounin sensei, leaving Naruto alone in stunned silence, holding the file on his new students. In comparison to the other Jounin, Naruto had been decidedly without opinion. He understood the merits of all the arguments presented, and because this was his first time with any of the genin he had no real personal preference for some of them over the others. Now though, he definitely had an opinion. Tsunade-sama, he started anxiously, when the room had cleared and he had enough time to process this. Don't get me wrong, I agree with what you said and you're the Hokage and also I'm not going to question it, but are you sure you should be giving this team to me? His other two genin were a pair he knew quite well. One of them couldn't look him in the eye or speak to him without stuttering, and the other one had a disdain for him that was only rivaled by his disdain for his cousin, the cousin he was, incidentally, now on a team with. Tsunade looked up from her paperwork, sparing him an unmoved glance. Is there a problem? Yes, there was a problem. Maybe at some point in his life he would have started shouting at her, but at this point he only rubbed his temples, taking a calming breath. A few, yes, Naruto replied after a beat, composed and collected. First off, these two have wildly different characteristics that are going to be antagonistic and detrimental to the team. Secondly, especially in the case of Hyuga Neji, insubordination is most likely going to be a severe issue. Tsunade tilted her head at him, appraising him with an inscrutable look. Yes, I know, she replied, coolly. Naruto blinked at her. You don't care? Like I said earlier, The prior team formations picked by the Sandame only served to intensify the issues that were already made apparent in the academy reports. She leaned over her desk. As an example, Hyuga Hinata was already known to be incredibly shy and withdrawn, especially in the face of confrontation. This was a known weakness, and because of this she was put on a team with Inuzuka Kiba and Aburame Shino. Shino is also known to be non-confrontational. And while Kiba is considered more aggressive and hot-tempered and prone to picking fights, because of the strong matriarchal bonds of the Inuzuka family he holds a great deal of respect for women and would never intentionally insult or berate Hinata. And of course, Kurina Yuji would be an ideal sensei, a competent and strong jounin whose teaching style is gentle and nurturing. Naruto frowned. You're saying that team was formed entirely around Hinata? It wouldn't be the first time a clan heir got preferential treatment like that. Tsunade crossed her arms, making a non-committal noise. But the three combined also make for an excellent tracking team. But what's the point in having three trackers all on one team? The result is a team that is highly skilled in reconnaissance, but aside from what was taught by their clans they lack offensive capabilities. I guess that makes sense, Naruto allowed, scratching the back of his neck. But what about the other teams? The Inoshikacho team was well-rounded, but already broken up due to Shikamaru's promotion. And for the record, they're a shining example of exactly what I don't want to happen. Yamanaka Ino and Akimichi Chuji grew complacent in their roles, leaving Shikamaru to pick up the slack. The result is Shikamaru being promoted, and the other two staying genin for another year. Unfortunately, if I tried to break up such an infamous team I'd never hear the end of it, so the two are staying together. However, for all their animosity, I think Yamanaka Ino and Haruno Sakura do a lot to better themselves, as rivalries tend to do, which is why I added Sakura to their team. Hopefully by extension this will inspire Chuji to put in more effort, as he won't want to get left behind. Naruto's brow creased. What about Team 7? He almost didn't want to ask, but a part of him was too curious to simply let the subject go. Tsunade was silent for a moment. I'm going to be honest with you, Naruto. Your team was probably the most well-balanced of all of them, and it wasn't even intentional, she said seriously, looking him straight in the eye and catching him by surprise. They took the worst-performing student and the best-performing student and hoped they'd even each other out, and threw in the odd man out of the class that had ended up being the last pick due to preferential clan treatment. And then they shoved Kakashi at you all because of the Uchiha. He blinked. Had they really been the most balanced team? It certainly hadn't seemed like it at the time, but he could see her point now. And what she had said about rivalries really resonated with him. He wouldn't have tried as hard as he did if he wasn't constantly measuring himself up to Sasuke. Now for Guy's team, well, Tenten I think will do well on any team. She has an amicable temperament, is hardworking, and gets along well with others. She's an able weapons tactician, and she would have been promoted this year if she filled out her genjutsu and ninjutsu a bit more. I have no intention to separate Guy and Rock Lee, and I don't necessarily mean that in a good way. She gave a loud capitulation, a crease of irritation between her brows. As for Hyuga Niji, quite frankly, I think his temperament is troubling. His unwillingness to work with others is an obstacle, and right now his current team is doing literally nothing to resolve these issues. He thinks his teammates are beneath him, and quite frankly, maybe they are because they do nothing to disprove him and let him get away with that kind of attitude, and he's respectful enough to guide that guy lets it slide. There was a knock on the door, Tsunade not missing a beat as she ushered them inside. I know very well that he's a problematic genin to work with. She continued on, as Naruto turned around to see his ANBU team filing in. And I agree, insubordination is going to be a huge issue for you. Honestly, I'm hoping for that. He returned his gaze to her, surprised. You are? Oh yes. She smirked. I'm counting on you to put him in his place. I was going to call a one-on-one meeting with all the teachers later on in the week, but I may as well give you yours now. Hinata's biggest obstacle is her shyness and lack of confidence. From what I can tell, she's actually quite talented, but feels overshadowed and overwhelmed by her family. Niji has the superiority complex of all prodigies, but a matching inferiority complex brought on from his position as a branch member that's worsening the problem. How you chose to deal with them, I leave up to you. And as for Fu, she segued smoothly. You tell me. How did your mission to Takigakure go? Yamato stepped forward. Excellently. Shibuki-sama was a bit hesitant at first, but by the end of it renewed his alliance to us and vouched his full support in whatever capacity in regards to Akatsuki. He glanced at Naruto, who stood to attention, clearing his throat. Fu, well, that worked itself out nicely, if I'm being honest. But anyway, yeah, she's here. I'm looking forward to teaching her. She's hardworking and willing to learn. I'm not sure how well she'll work together with the other two, but I have no reason to suspect her incapable. Good. Tsunade nodded. Do you have the signed contract? His captain procured it from one of his pockets, handing the scroll to the Hokage. No complications? Yugao handed him another scroll, which he passed on to the Hokage. No. Most of the details are written in my report, but my largest concern revolves around the political climate of Takidakir. Their Kage is new and inexperienced, and his young age makes him a ripe target for exploitation. I see. The Hokage replied pensively, taking both of them. Well, I suppose we'll just have to wait and see. The end.